This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Right, good morning everybody and welcome to the London Assembly Economy, Culture and Skills Committee and our investigation and the first part of our investigation into London's nighttime economy. Before we start, we have some business. members of the public may like to follow us today using the hashtag Assembly Economy or at London Assembly. And please may I remind everyone to switch all your phones to silent mode and ask that members and guests ensure that electronic devices are not placed in front of their microphones. Members and guests are also reminded to position their microphones so that they can be heard clearly. So you might just want to bring it a little bit closer to you. And if you need to move your microphone, please do it this way rather than grabbing it by the microphone, which breaks it. Our main item of business, as I said, is the committee's investigation into London's nighttime economy. Can I now ask our committee officer to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies have been received from Assembly Member Garrett.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? Thank you. I'm proposing that we take agenda items 3, 4 and 5 together. Can I ask the committee to note the membership and chairing arrangements, the terms of reference for the committee and the standing delegations of authority to the chair as agreed at the Assembly's annual meeting on the 10th of May 2024? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the meeting held on 6th of February to be signed by me as a correct record? Goodness, 6th February seems like a very long time ago, but people do insist on calling elections. Can I ask the committee to note the completed, ongoing and closed actions arising from the previous meeting? Can I ask the committee to note the actions taken by me as chair, namely to agree the committee's letters and reports as outlined on the agenda report? Can I ask the committee to note the responses received to the committee's report on London's post-pandemic labour market as outlined on the agenda report? Thank you. We now move on to our main item of business, which is a discussion with our invited guests on the committee's investigation into the London's nighttime economy. The meeting will be split into 2 parts, with the first one focusing on recovery from the pandemic and long-term challenges facing the nighttime economy, and the second part will look at the role of licences as well as LGBTQ+ and grassroots music venues. Before introducing our guests, I just would like to make a note about the agenda report. The agenda report for this item contained an error in stating that in between March 2020 and December 2023, London lost over 3,000 nighttime economy businesses. The figure of 3,000 closures was taken from a report from the Nighttime Industries Association, but in fact refers to a much larger area covering London and surrounding areas in the southeast. I'll now welcome our panel of guests. Firstly, Michael Kill, who is the Chief Executive of the Nighttime Industries Association. Welcome, Michael. Joan Moynihan, who is the Executive Director of NIMAX Theatres. Good morning, Joan. Simon Tracy, who is the Group Chief Executive of Broadwick Group, and Mark Williams, the Deputy Chief Executive of Heart of London Business Alliance. And welcome to you both. So I will start with asking the first question, and so before we do that though, what I'm going to say to the panel is there is so much that we need to look at and discuss, so I'm going to ask you to keep your answers as succinct as possible, and please don't be offended if an Assembly member interrupts and asks you to move on, quite simply because we've got so much to get through. I'm going to ask a question of all of you, but in your answer, if you could just spend a few seconds just explaining, what it is that your organisation does, and then move on to answering the question. So my first question to all of you is, nearly 3 years on from the lifting of all restrictions on the 19th of July 2021, so virtually exactly 3 years ago, to what extent has the nighttime sector recovered from the pandemic? And Michael, I am going to start with you.
Thank you, Chair. We represent 10,000 businesses across the UK that operate between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. in the morning, so very relevant, the sort of nighttime economy in London. In really simple terms, the London nighttime economy is still in a process of trying to regain recovery. As you can imagine, the pandemic left us, many of the businesses, in debt, particularly some of the late night economy, but what we have seen really is where the double dip between the pandemic and the cost of daily living or cost of operating crisis came in, we are still seeing that challenge in terms of trying to recoup our position. So not only have you got the legacy of debt from the pandemic, but you're also now challenged with a 30 to 40% increase in operating costs. And then on top of that, a 15% downturn in trade in terms of footfall because people have got less disposable income. So it's almost the perfect storm in terms of where we are. So we still haven't managed to regain. I think the UK figures are suggesting 23,000 losses, and just to redirect off the back of the correction, it's 1,596 businesses that have been lost since March 2020 in Greater London as a whole, and I think that's been agreed by the 24-hour office as well. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Joan. Joan, sorry, could you turn your microphone? Thank you. Thank you.
I'm the Executive Director of NIMAX Theatres, which owns 6 historic West End theatres, and also the Executive Director of Soho Place, which is the first new build theatre in the West End in 50 years. And I'm here in that respect and also to represent the Society of London Theatre and UK Theatres. We're very grateful for this opportunity. If I could just put into context before answering strengths and weaknesses since the pandemic, I think everyone understands the social power of theatre, that it's a transformative force for good. Not everyone understands what an economic powerhouse theatre is. On average, 30,000 people a night see a West End show. Of those, 70% eat out and 15% pay for accommodation. The theatre sector in the UK generates 2.39 billion pounds in gross value added and supports hundreds of thousands of workers. And of those figures, in terms of the wider economy, for every £1 spent, an additional £1.40 is spent on local economies. So when the pandemic hit, we were perhaps one of the main industries that had to close our doors completely. We couldn't do takeaways, we couldn't open up a little bit. Our doors were closed to the public. That had a significant effect on the industry. Particularly in our industry, a lot of our workers are freelancers, so couldn't access furlough, and a lot of them couldn't access the self-supporting, self-employed scheme. Actually, the theatre is very resilient and resourceful. We did everything we could, as people will have seen, to reopen during the pandemic. So NIMAX reopened 3 times, whether that was with distancing, with health and safety measures. And London has recovered well from the pandemic, more than the rest of the country. But what we do see is a looming skill shortage, not on the stage, but in the backstage. Many, many fascinating, interesting and necessary roles in production, in operation, hair, makeup, set building, all of those roles, a very concerning skill shortage and a need for somehow to bridge that gap. And we lost freelancers during the pandemic and post-Brexit to other countries and to other industries, and they're not coming back.
Thank you. Simon.
Hello, good morning. Simon Tracy from Broadwick. So Broadwick is owner and operator of 25 hybrid spaces across the country, with obviously a concentration of those in London. I think I'm here today notably for some of our more entertainment-led venues. So Printworks London, which is being redeveloped, Drum Sheds, which is just out on the North Circle in Enfield Council, and some of our other venues also put on live entertainment in the night time. I'm not going to repeat what Mike said because he eloquently, and for time, I echo a lot of what he said, but obviously he's living it from a trade association point of view. I'm living it as an actual business, living and breathing it. Obviously the pandemic was very difficult for us as a business because we were one of the first businesses to be told to close and one of the last to be allowed to open again. And then off of the back of that, we just neatly went into a cost of living crisis and high energy bills, etc., etc. etc. So as Mike said, a lot of pressure on us as a business. We obviously had to survive the pandemic, so used all of our cash reserves and various different relief available to us, which was helpful, but there definitely was a sort of cliff edge back. So while there is demand, people still want to go out and enjoy culture again, probably more so now because they were forced not to for a long period of time. It's expensive for them to do that, so that obviously suppresses that, and all sorts of things fell away post-pandemic. A good example of that is, for us, business rates relief. There is still relief in place, but it's applied to a portfolio rather than an individual venue point of view. So there's no reason why, because we have more than one venue, we should be penalised as a result of that. So there's simple things like that could be improved. But I think on the whole, the positive is the demand's there, and this as an industry can recover, but it's definitely not out of the woods yet. So I'm very pleased that there's sessions like this today to look at it and look at this industry more closely.
And we will, of course, be looking at recovery and solutions as well. Thank you. Thank you very much. Mark.
Good morning. I'm Deputy Chief Executive of Heart of London Business Alliance. We represent 500 members across the central portion of the West End, so a significant part of the UK's nighttime economy. We are the first bid in the country to launch our own nighttime strategy. The West End's evening nighttime economy is underperforming post-pandemic. Growth lines dictated it should be at about 15.5 billion. It's currently sitting at around 14 billion. Footfall has stagnated. Spend has increased, but behind that picture, we're dealing with high living costs, supply disruption, high operating costs, staff shortages, overcrowding on streets and with ineffective public realm, limited step-free access to stations, an increase in antisocial behaviour, and a lack of facilities. So, you know, whilst on the outside everything looks fantastic, behind the scenes in our member businesses, they are struggling to perform.
Thank you very much. So my next question is specifically to Joan. Joan, to what extent has London's theatre sector recovered from the pandemic, and what challenges remain for that sector?
Thank you. So, as I mentioned briefly, London's West End has recovered well from the pandemic, the rest of the UK less so. I've talked about the skills shortage, freelancers leaving the industry, significant cost increases across the board, as my colleagues will attest. That's in the cost of set building, building maintenance, staff costs, training, rises in utility bills up 120%. At the worst of the energy crisis, we ourselves saw our utility bills going up 300%. Local authority funding cuts, I would say the lack of investment in the arts. Although I work for a commercial company, we are very bound up with the subsidised sector. It's an ecosystem. So just to give you some examples, we programmed last year a play called Red Pitch. It was written and directed and performed by a group of young black men. Similarly, for White Boys Who Consider Suicide, we had 2 successful runs. Both of those, one came from the Royal Court, one came from the Bush Theatre. We're currently programming 2 shows from the National, Hadestown, and Death of England. And so our economy as commercial theatre owners and operators is entirely caught up in the subsidised sector, and there's been a massive reduction in funding in the subsidised sector.
Thank you very much. Simon, what do you see as the greatest challenge currently facing your business?
I think it's probably 2 things. I know you said greatest, but 2 things. One is from a resource point of view. The pandemic obviously led lots of people to have to go and find other work, and that definitely hasn't come back. So you're either having to pay a premium to get the staff to then, and some of the events we do require up to 1,000 people per show, so it's difficult to get that. So that's challenging, and also just the fact that as businesses, you're having to make more money to make the same amount of money you did pre-pandemic, but there's a reduced amount of spend per person because of the cost of living. So you're sort of being stretched in both directions. So it's very difficult to operate and be financially viable. And as a result of that, lots of other things fall away. So you sort of start centering on your core business, and then you sort of stop doing some of the other things that are so important to make London a culturally significant capital, because you're just sort of trying to survive ultimately.
And on the back of that, what do you see in terms of challenges for the next 12 months?
I think we're a business that is currently viable because we're probably slightly bigger than some of the smaller or middle-sized and independent businesses, but those are absolutely critical for our survival, because it's impossible to book talent and sell lots of tickets if those individuals haven't been able to hone their craft elsewhere and build followings and have the ability to sell tickets. So every time Mike or someone announces the closure of a smaller venue or an independent venue, it's deeply painful to us, because you're slowly but surely destroying the ecosystem that we're very much part of. So I think while, yes, we could continue, that's only sustainable if you've got the support for those smaller and medium-sized independent businesses as well.
Thank you, and I like the phrase ecosystem and the way that you've described that. I'd like to hand over to Assembly Member Small-Edwards now for the next questions.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning to the panel. I'm James Small-Edwards. I represent West Central, so a lot of the West End is in the area that I represent, so a very important discussion for me and one I was really keen to have, and yeah, thank you very much for joining us. My first question is to Mark, and you mentioned footfall in the West End earlier. I just wanted you to expand a bit on where footfall is compared to kind of pre-pandemic levels, and to what extent the nighttime leisure sector has made a recovery in the West End.
So we welcome also 150 million people a year through into the West End. So we're starting from a high base, that we're looking at a significant drop in international footfall and a change in working patterns, which is shift with the office sector. So you're getting a lot less of the frequency in terms of visitors coming in. It's shifted the days that people go out. People are spending when they do come in. So you've got that middle of the week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Thursday particularly being a peak for after work socialising, and the transport systems are not quite up to match in terms of that late night, like you have the weekend, you have the night tube.
Thank you. And to Mark and to Michael, what extent has London's nighttime economy been impacted by cost of living pressures, I think both on consumers and businesses, and increases in the cost of doing business?
I think the biggest threat to our businesses in the West End is the high cost of doing businesses. So costs have significantly gone up for all of our businesses in the West End. So there are pressures to keep obviously the pricing low. So there is a massive threat in terms of the ability to generate revenue.
Just to comment, I mean, in simple terms, the way it's impacted is dwell time, spend, and frequency of visit. That's where we've seen the biggest hit. So what we're seeing is people coming out later. So in simple terms, when we used to have student sessions, preloading was the thing. They would go to a supermarket where they could get cheap product. They would drink early, come out later, and the period of time that they would spend in our environments is much shorter. We've definitely seen midweek trade really struggle. Some of that is down to the economic situation, but other parts of that is down to things like transport infrastructure post 11 o'clock. And there are some challenges, particularly in areas like Soho, where safety is a real concern as well, particularly for things like the LGBTQ+ community. The one thing that we are sort of massively concerned with, and this is a general trend across the UK, is we've seen a 13% contraction in grassroots or SME businesses compared to a 3% contraction in managed or corporate. So we can clearly see that not only are we losing those, but there is somewhat of a cannibalisation where corporates are buying independents because many of them are becoming distressed assets because they are unable to keep up or have the cash fluidity to survive. So that's where the sort of challenges are for us as we see them at the moment.
Thank you very much. And to Joan and Michael, but I think maybe others, if you're interested, please do come in as well on this. Do you think Brexit has had any discernible impact on the nighttime leisure sector?
To refer to my earlier answer, certainly in terms of our skills shortage, yes.
If I can come in on that as well, I mean, we are seeing much more ease in terms of people coming across with higher levels of skills than general staffing. And I think probably the way that I would describe that is that if I give you an example, in Camden as a whole, what we were seeing is people were talking to me as if to say there are lots of variation of different accents, particularly New Zealand and Australian accents, and we seem to have lost that resonating mix of international sort of workforce that really sort of cross-fertilised different skill bases, which was really important for that sort of cultural integrity that we held. So I think without a doubt we have lost that international feel, and it's very, very difficult to sort of get people to come in. There are some concerns with regard to the evolving position for Labour government, particularly around the sort of lower age groups, which are, you know, we're losing those sort of rates of pay. National living wage is going to come in, and when we start to see the business rates withdrawn, if that's the way that it happens and it's not phased, as you can appreciate, when the national living wage was announced, I think it was a week before the budget was announced, and the 75% extension of business rates, that almost fulfilled a goal between the two, because it paid for each other. It paid for the national living wage. The challenge we've got is if that is withdrawn straight away instead of phased out, we are going to see potentially, whether it's autumn budget or spring budget, quite a considerable impact on the industry, because the affordability of national living wage is going to be challenging. I don't think anyone out there is not interested in ensuring that we can pay our staff the right level of money. The challenge you have is whether businesses in the current environment can afford it.
Could I just add something to that? Thank you. Additionally to what Michael's just said, the issue of 0 hours contracts, which we know is very live for everybody, actually in our industry there is a difference between the unscrupulous employers that are portrayed in the media and the flexibility that casual contracts, which are legitimate worker contracts, where there is a mutuality. And actually what we find in the theatre is that frequently our staff want to be on casual contracts because they're often performers, or they have family caring rights, or they're students, and it allows them the flexibility. Our experience is that when casual workers have worked for us for a while, we offer them a permanent contract or a show contract, and they choose not to take it. And so that there is a flexibility that works both ways, that technically would fall under a 0 hours contract, but is certainly not the sort of contracts that are being played out in the media. And the loss of that ability will have an impact on the industry. And casual contracts are also a way of introducing new skills into the industry with people who don't have experience, particularly on the technical side, to give them an opportunity to see if that's an industry they want to work in.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. Assembly Member Georgiou.
Thank you, Chair. Michael, you mentioning preloading has taken me back to my university days, which I was really hoping to forget. One of the things, Michael, that you've raised is obviously viability, and particularly when it comes to business rates, which I know is a massive burden on businesses like yours. So can you give the committee a summary of the financial viability of businesses needing to operate at night, as well as commercial judgments that need to make to meet ongoing financial obligations with an additional margin of comfort to support future investment and trading? Because obviously all of you are operating at thin margins compared to other corporations and businesses not within your sector. So how do you make it work, and how will you make it work going into the future?
Hugely challenging. I mean, just to be very clear, the investment in the future has almost been consumed by the increase of the cost of operating, being quite straightforward about it. Without a doubt, there is a very challenging environment where we're seeing supply chain passing on costs, but frontline businesses only being able to considerably pass on a certain amount of that cost base. That's why you've seen a lot of narrative around the cost of pints and et cetera going up, and whether London is too expensive, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's a fine line between deterring people coming out, the fact that they're not able to spend, the fact that they're going to come out later, and also that rolls into accessibility, because when you look at the overall engagement of a night out and people having less disposable income, that feeds into that frequency dwell time and spend. So we're kind of in that perfect storm environment. Survival is almost, in some respects, I would love to say it's more judgment than luck, but I think some of it is timing. A lot of those businesses that invested in their businesses just prior to the pandemic fell short because they used their cash flow, and now they're moving into a period where they're, from a ground zero trying to survive. So timing is an important piece. The other thing that I think is really important to sort of bring up is the fact that, when you talk about national living wage, whether you talk about energy hasn't, gone away. Ofgem's very clear message to us in high-level meetings is the fact that the energy costs are here to stay. They're not going. So, we are talking about a very, very different business model, and where that's turned around in a very, very short period of time, the concern is it is going to cut the wheat from the chaff. And there are some intimations that sometimes sort of cutting away some of the weak businesses that are all by heart rather than mind is a good thing, but in many respects, there are some important businesses out there that we need to safeguard. So I think the biggest challenge that we have at the moment is we still have so much financial uncertainty. We don't know what the new government is going to do in terms of the autumn and spring budget. We don't know if we're going to get extensions of relief or phasing. So in terms of planning, we're still left with that uncertainty that we've had for the last 3 or 4 years. So I think the challenge we have at the moment is we are looking at moving into a very, very different cost-based model for our industry. And with that, we're going to have to consider that some of these businesses are not going to survive, sadly, but we are working towards trying to model them in the right way. All of those cost increases, some of them that are not going away, some of them that are, without a doubt, with the autumn budget coming in, there potentially are going to be some tax increases. All of those are going to exacerbate the position, and the potential for these reliefs to be removed will put many of these businesses in a compromised position. They're going to have to make, business critical decisions, and that's just the way things are. But that uncertainty piece is the killer for us and has been for the last 4 or 5 years.
Thank you. And for what it's worth, I do agree. I think business rates are a punitive tax in the way that they're levelled against industries like yours. But my final question, I'm genuinely for Joan and Michael, if we could have a short response, because I don't want to kick this hornet's nest of Brexit. But as part of the previous government's hospitality strategy, it outlined that hospitality businesses can build on the opportunities of Brexit by attracting more homegrown talent to hospitality. And I know you've alluded somewhat to it already, and improving training schemes, including apprenticeships. Do you therefore acknowledge that Brexit could possibly improve some skills, depending on which way you look at it? As I say, short answers, and I'm not looking to kick the hornet's nest, I promise.
I'm going to focus on the need for training. To quote Whitney, the children are our future. We very much believe in the importance of, if we are to achieve that aspiration, I can't comment on whether it was an opportunity or not. We need to be valuing the creative industries, encouraging the creative industries in education. There are various, initiatives that are benefiting. Theatre does Kids Week, which isn't a week, it's across the summer. We've seen 1.7 million children come through that since it started. We are running a campaign of Theatre for Every Child. It is all about, we're not going to achieve that unless we can start with the children, then have skills boot camps, training facilities. We're doing that in our own industry. The National Theatre's doing it. The South Bank has a training skills academy. Cameron Mackintosh has set up an academy. We need support and focused apprenticeships on our sort of more bespoke to our industry in order to get that homegrown talent into our jobs. And they're not just, as a lot of the kids think, being on the stage, being performers. We need our children to understand, I'm an example of it, there are really fantastic, interesting jobs in theatre from every level, from management, production, operation, hair and makeup, set building, all of these incredible opportunities. And if we can make people aware of that and encourage them and fund that, then we will see homegrown talent working in our industry.
I would just say it like this: the intention and the practicalities of delivering are two different things. So what's written on paper and what's going to happen out there are two very different things. Our industry is seen as a stepping stone, almost like a curator of characters. We've got to start delivering it as a career moment and reinforce it with the support, the apprenticeships and everything around it. So it's almost like the intention is there, the words are there, but we haven't got the infrastructure to support that talent pipeline that brings those people through and really start to change the narrative to career path rather than interim job that takes you through to another career. That's a bit that we need to change, and I think that's an important part. But it's almost like we've said what we wanted to do, but we haven't been prepared for it.
Thank you very much. Before we move on to you, Assembly Member Polanski, I want to just pick up something that you said, Joan, about 0 hours contracts, and that flexibility that you've referred to. We do see that in a number of industries, and I know that the present government policy is very much about banning exploitative 0 hour contracts, and there seems to be a meeting of minds on what you're saying. But could I also ask you touched on the issue of our homegrown talent and how we do that. Do you think the present education curriculum encourages that creativity?
I think there's always room for improvement, and if I can give a personal response, my daughter has just been told she can't study drama A-level at her North London comprehensive school, so I think that helps towards your answer.
Right, thank you very much. Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning all. I'll avoid kicking the Brexit hornet nest from the other side of the political spectrum, so you can all be squeezed in the middle. Joan, I just want to come back to theatre for a moment. I'm a former theatre actor, so I very much appreciated what you said. And Little Big Things, I think, at the other place was an amazing example of disability on stage and representation. It was a wonderful performance. You're talking about this ecosystem, and we know we did a report for the Economy Committee under Assemblymember Bokhari called Culture Off the Beaten Track, which was much more about the fringe venues and theatres that people haven't necessarily heard of unless they're in those local areas. What's happening to those venues at the moment?
I think I'm full of examples, because the most successful show that's been in our Duchess Theatre for 4 years is a show that came from the Edinburgh Fringe. So just to really enforce home that we are an ecosystem, both from subsidised sector and from the fringe sector. Back to the same arguments, it's very, very difficult. The funding is not there, and often, as you know better than anybody else, in order to get a production on in the fringe, it is often the performers are coming together, they're finding the funding, they're, mortgaging their houses and putting a show on in order to get an audience, and so to get some visibility. And that's, in this economy, virtually impossible. People just can't do that. The old-fashioned producers who literally put everything they had on the line, got in a car, went to Edinburgh, found some actor. It's impossible in this economy, and there's no support for them. And people just can barely afford their food, as you know. They can't be affording to do that.
Absolutely. And do you think there's anything more that the Mayor could be doing to leverage with those big venues to connect them with some of those smaller venues in terms of it being an ecosystem, or do you think everything that's being done can be done?
I think our industry is incredibly collaborative, and what is helpful is when policymakers understand our industry. So what we'd probably ask more than anything today is that policymakers engage with us. We're good at what we do, we are resourceful, we are resilient, we want to share, we want people to really understand how we operate, rather than making policies and sort of hoping that they fit, and then it turns out it's square pegs and round holes. Often things aren't exactly as they seem. I think the 0 hours contract comment is an example of that. Of course, we don't want unscrupulous contracts in our business. We're heavily unionised, and that's very much to the good. There's a really healthy relationship in our unionised sector, and we're grateful for that. But I think it's all about understanding what the issues are and applying policies towards that, and obviously always funding.
Well articulated, thank you. Michael, in 2022 we hit an all-time high for vacancies in the sectors. What's staff shortages looking like now?
Still challenges, without a doubt. I think we are... I think one of the things we suffered with during the pandemic was the uncertainty sort of drove people away from our industry. As you can appreciate, if you talk about security, if you talk about some of these skilled workers, they had to go and find something else because we were closed. So what we are still doing is rebuilding that confidence in re-entering the sector, particularly as we've gone through the cost of operating crisis, and we're having to be very fine-tuned in terms of our costs, particularly remuneration being a really big one. We spoke about things like midweek and not having late sessions anymore because the market and the environments that we're sort of within, particularly in London, around transport and etc., is pushing the market to go home early because they want to be able to get the transport home and they've got work and etc. But you're also looking at environments where, the office workers are only in 2 or 3 days a week. So, what they tend to do, being quite frank about it, and you would as well, is you don't come in on a Friday because it's a longer weekend as well. So you can knock yourself off. So that Friday afternoon where you would normally go for a pint in the city or etc. is not there. So I think the challenge is that obviously is reflects in the remuneration and the requirement for the staffing numbers, but also the national living wage, and that hike will also make operators refine how many people they've got on and potentially stretch some of the staff, and that places pressure on. And then we've also got to consider the wellbeing element off the back of it. So I think for us at the moment, it's still extremely challenging. It's still expensive to get people on board. I think we've got to change our process and the way that we look at things. And I'll give you a really simple example as quick as I can. There was a casino company that decided to go from minimum wage up to £15 an hour. The money that they spent on driving recruitment, they replenished or got back on retention by paying people more. So our attitudes toward people have got to change. And there are some really good examples over there of paying way over and above to retain and keep that retention strong, because you're only spending it in the other, trying to recruit. So for us, I think we've just got to change our mentality to our people. The national living wage, I think, is a positive thing, but you've got to be able to afford it. So I think at the moment, as it sits, it's still hugely challenging and very, very competitive. But I do think we need to just change that narrative and approach to trying to retain people rather than, and without a doubt, we're missing that sort of international contingent. It's making it, very, very, very difficult. One last point, on 0-hour contracts, security is a massive issue. What they're doing is HMRC are pushing over to PAYE now from self-employed, and as they start to do that, 0-hour contracts for security people working in multitudes of different spaces is going to be very, very difficult, and many of these security companies will not be able to fit the bill. And I think you'll find that that will be a bigger issue given Martin's Law coming in, and the requirement for frontline security could be a real compromise in terms of public safety and public spaces.
Thank you. Simon, can I come to you on this point? So obviously hugely important to pay people properly. How much is low pay driving some of these staff shortages, and do you think it's about other things too?
So some time ago, Boardwick committed to London living wage, and in actual fact, that was an easy thing for us to do because most of our staff are over and above that. But the challenge for us is our supply network. So to deliver 1,000 people at one of our shows, there's obviously multiple security guards, as Mike said, multiple bar staff, cleaning staff, etc., etc., etc. So the challenges they have to be able to meet the commitment that we're making is far greater. We will always pay them enough money so they have the ability to do that, but all of these businesses are very, very low margin businesses, so they might be delivering 500 staff, but they might be making like less than £1 per person on that. So the pressures to then pay the people properly gets harder and harder. And then what that leads to us is, because they're not doing that, people are going and finding other work, and then therefore you've got a massive skill shortage. So it's like a sort of endless cycle. So while we can commit to being London living wage, it's about trying to get that to drip through all the way through the sort of supply chain network, and things like 0 hours contracts and stuff is, as I said, nobody's trying to give people bad contracts, but quite often the people that come and work in some of our venues, it's all about flexibility, and it seems that might get lost in the mix of trying to sort of knuckle down on unscrupulous employers, and then you're basically taking work away from people that actually want the flexibility to be able to pick and choose when they do their hours. Quite often second jobs as well. Some of the people are doing flexible jobs because they've got one job during the day and then they're doing other stuff at weekends or the evenings just to sort of make ends meet, and so they need that flexibility.
And what would you say are the main obstacles then in recruiting staff other than this pay issue?
For us, working from home is a big problem for us. Everyone likes to work from home these days, which impacts Friday trades. I mean, I think we're slightly different. Like, we obviously run entertainment venues. I never really answered the question. The only reason why Broadwick is viable and the reason we survive is we run hybrid spaces. So Monday to Friday we might do brand and corporate events, and then only put entertainment on a Saturday or maybe a Friday night. I really do not know how anyone doing a pure entertainment venue would survive in this current environment. It's almost impossible. All of that midweek trade has basically disappeared. Live examples, I've got 2 kids at university, same thing. People go out for the big experiences now. If you're competing with alcohol at home, it's very, very difficult for a traditional nightclub or bar to be able to survive in that thing. So our business model is slightly different, so it allows us to survive. But in terms of financial support and grants and relief, yes, the VAT thing was a lifesaver, and then that has never been replaced, and I know Mike and probably yourself constantly campaign for that because that would be something quite easy to put in place. The business rates relief we've discussed, but just the whole process of operating as a business. If you wanted to entrepreneurially set up a venue today, first of all you've got to negotiate a lease with the landlord, and that can be expensive. Then when you've gone through that process, you've got to go into licensing and planning, and something I think the GLA should really do is look at having more involvement, because it's such a smorgasbord of differences across the various different councils, quite often not really understanding what culture delivers in their locality. So I think the more that these things can be decided upon centrally and a strategy applied, the better, because all that leads to is massive expense for the operator to employ licensing lawyers, planning, endless planning surveys that are irrelevant, trying to unpick policy, all of that really, really difficult. And then just as you get all of that, you get slapped with stamp duty for the commercial benefit of a lease over 5 years. You've not even operated or made a single penny at this point. Then you have to fit out the venue, more and more expense. Then you have to program all of this before you've made your first penny, which makes the barrier to entry into this as an industry now almost impossible for an independent. And then you're opening up into a world of huge costs and cost of living crisis. So it's not even that attractive. And then you're struggling with resource and the pandemic pushing people into other jobs. I don't want to sound downbeat about it because we survive in this environment, but the work that some of these associations do and the importance of being listened to is absolutely essential. It took the events industry about a year of the pandemic to even explain to central government what we do and how we contribute to the economy, because there were so many different groups involved. But it's absolutely essential. If the Labour government are clear on growth, the best way of doing growth is to actually enable entrepreneurs like myself and like other people, give them the ability to actually help grow this economy. But if you just cover it in red tape and then you putting people into an environment of really difficult operating, it's going to be impossible to grow the economy because everyone's just going to sit on their hands.
Thank you. Can I ask you all the final question then? And it might be you don't have an answer for this, but I want to come to the red tape and the 0 hours contract. So I've heard repeatedly from you that we don't want unscrupulous people exploiting often younger workers or migrant workers. And at the same time, we're hearing that we want this casuality. The problem I hear that, again, having been a former theatre actor and being on these 0 hours contracts, is there is a power dynamic, isn't there? Whereas if you're the young person, or you don't even have to be young, and you're working for a company or an employer who you feel is unscrupulous, then there needs to be some kind of regulation there to protect you. What do you think that looks like? Like, how do we both make sure that people have that flexibility, but also that people are protected at the workplace?
I mean, I'm not sure I can answer that, but I'll try. I think often there isn't the power dynamic that you think there is. And I'm sorry if you had a bad experience, but as I say, I think in our industry there is a real mutuality, and also, unlike some zero-hours contracts, we're absolutely encourage and allow people to work anywhere they want to at other times, but they're not exclusive contracts. So there's actually quite a lot of movement in our business around other theatres. So there are quite a lot. There are now more job opportunities. I expect it's got to be right that there are no wholesale answers. So to answer your question, it is about engagement, I'm afraid, on the detail to ensure that everybody's being protected and everybody's being heard. So listen to us, listen to your younger self or the people who are having these. It's about engagement with both sides, and I think everybody will be surprised at what is not an issue, and then we can all bottom out what the issues are and address those. Nobody in the theatre industry or in the nighttime is interested in exploiting anybody. It's not in our commercial interests. You know, happy workforce, successful organisation.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with Joan. It's a difficult question. I haven't got the perfect answer. I wish I did. But I think it's very easy to look at big corporates that use 0 hours as a commercial advantage and this industry that it's a necessity. You've just got to look at our operating hours. We are not working 40 hours a week every week, so there's peaks and troughs. So if you take away the flexibility of being able to employ people within those peaks and troughs, it will be almost impossible to operate as a business, because you have to scale up and scale down just to make these things affordable. So there is no answer, but I agree with Joan. It's about looking at the detail of that, because the last thing anyone wants to do is say, yes, we're making a commercial advantage out of this, because it's not. It's a necessity thing. So it just needs to get the policy right, so it allows people to operate fairly, but without taking away the ability to operate.
Thank you all. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Bakari.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to go back into that point about the issues with workforce and employment, and also this touches on Brexit, actually. Maybe Mark can help me with this question. Do you think that there needs to be a change to the UK skilled worker visa in order to increase labour pool?
I'll actually follow up with some information on this. I don't have anything with me, but I think the key, the challenge in our area is, our businesses have tried to employ locally and have struggled. A big, the ask goes out constantly for that. The optics need to change in terms of the nighttime industries and it being a career and a career path. So the local workers want to go into that sector and grow their career for the duration. I don't think we have that right in this country. A lot of other countries, hospitality, for example, is far higher up the food chain in terms of what a career looks like. So there is a gap there. So we have a skill shortage. It's a constant issue. I agree with Michael's points on those earlier. It's a big challenge for our businesses, and it's something we can't replace in a local way.
Okay, thank you, Michael and Joan. My question is on the mayor support for the nighttime economy. Now, we will be talking about licensing and councils that Simon was talking about earlier, but as this section is about the pandemic and the sector's recovery from that, what effect do you think the mayor support has had for the nighttime economy in this particular area? And are there any particular interventions that you'd like the mayor to take?
I expect my colleagues will speak more coherently about the obvious travel, transport, those sort of initiatives. I think for us, I'm back to my skills. Definitely the Mayor's Unpacking the Credits initiative has been helpful to raise awareness of jobs. There is a TfL free travel for kids scheme. Unfortunately, the problem for us with that is that you have to be back on your travel by 4:30, and that just doesn't work for matinees. And I think that's an example of how engagement, forgive me for such an obvious point, if someone had engaged with our industries and understood that matinees end after 4:30, that would have been a fantastic initiative. So I think there are those things that have been helpful, but certainly, and I'm sure as they say, people will say more than I, but our audience members need to get in to town, they need to be able to have access if they are wheelchair users or have other issues. They need to go to the loo, and there are no public loos in town. So all of those things, I think, can help.
So accessibility is a major issue.
Yeah.
Thank you. Michael.
Thank you. I think the biggest challenge during the pandemic was there was so much uncertainty. Predictability was very difficult, not only for business but also for the Mayor's office, to understand what was going to go on from week to week, whether we were going to be open, shut, open to a proportion of what it was, made it very, very difficult all round. So planning was extremely hard. If I was going to ask the position that I would have felt more from the Mayor would have been about access, transport, and also safety, I think was a really key sort of environment. I mean, when you talk about access and transport, I think we were very slow to get up and going again. And definitely for our staffing, for the pubs that were sort of part open, I thought it was very, very difficult, particularly post 11 o'clock. But that's something we've suffered with for a long time. It's not something that's new. And does need some focus given the environment that we've almost created for the market now. So if I was going to say anything, I think it's that safety element and the transport piece. The last thing I think is really important. So we've come out the back of the pandemic, we've come into a cost of operating crisis, but the reality is the communities around us almost have been dropped in the deep end. We came into an environment where the nighttime economy opened, and those communities had peace and quiet for a long time, and now being indulged with people trying to get home. And if the transport infrastructure isn't there, people will walk, people will make those decisions and make noise. It's almost like the transport infrastructure post-11 is almost a solution for some of the safety elements or concerns that we have, as well as the noise and nuisance concerns that we are being hit with constantly now. So I do think those two key things are a really, really important element, and I would have probably liked to see more of a vision, but I do appreciate the fact that the Mayor was in a position where we didn't know when things were going to open, and starting up things like the night tube as effectively as we'd have liked to, and extending it is market-driven also. So while I appreciate there is a criticism there is also an understanding that it's not a straight switch on, switch off.
But it's not just market driven. I mean, and the issue, I'm sure that you've raised this before, is the people that work within the industry, people who are cleaners, who need that nighttime tube in the transport system as well. Michael, you've often praised Manchester and the way they have a thriving nighttime economy, and you've also, I've also seen an interesting, significant movement within Liverpool and Birmingham as well. The number of nighttime transactions in London has been overtaken there. Cities with smaller populations, granted. And actually with less comprehensive transport networks are seeming to do quite well. So is there anything that you could perhaps say that we should be learning from these cities here in London?
I think it's a difficult one. Every city makeup is very, very different. The transport infrastructure in London is quite unique. And I think, as you can appreciate, I don't think it's just the transport infrastructure and some of those issues that we faced in London. It's a huge beast, being quite honest. Manchester, Liverpool, although we talk to them about cities, they're not on the scale that London is, and the coordination of London across the boroughs is quite significant. What I would have liked to have seen, without a doubt, is a more coordinated approach in terms of us getting transport up and going, and that forethought of getting more and more into it. But I think the key thing is the synergy between TfL and the transport system, the Mayor's office and the industry to buy into that transport so that we can start to ebb closer to later night economy. I appreciate it's been impacted at the moment by the cost of operating, but the reality is that synergy between everyone working together, and I don't think we've got it right in London yet.
Right.
And I do think that there needs to be a stronger, very clear narrative and representation which shows London as that leading light is an important part that needs to be played. I think in Manchester and other cities we've seen it, even in Bristol, it's been really strong.
So the synergy is better there, do you think? Is that what
I think the synergy is better. I mean, and I also think that because they're a smaller animal, is that they can pivot a little bit easier. I mean, you're talking about a very, very, Birmingham is closer to where London is, but nowhere near the scale. So I think it's a very difficult challenge. It's not an overnight process between, the 24-hour office, the Night Tsar and the Mayor to collaborate that and get everything working and get the industry behind it. I think the one thing that we haven't done in London is get all of the industry behind us, rejuvenating. We've got parts of it and there are pockets that are doing really well, but I think there are also challenges in some of the boroughs.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Thank you. Assembly Member Giorgio.
There we go. Everyone wants to hear me. So Michael and Joan in particular, licensing and local authorities in particular can be an area of consternation, possibly, depending on how they handle things. Michael, you particularly touched upon the noise going home at night and things like that. So the Adam Smith Institute recently released a paper talking about the nighttime economy and this particular issue and reform of the planning and licensing systems to force local authorities to have a more strategic vision to the nighttime economy. I assume the answer is yes, you would welcome that approach, but if you were feeding back into government in changing this sort of legislation, what would you say?
Funny enough, we've done quite a bit of work with this with DBT, or Department of Business and Trade. Now, the approach from government prior to the election was about looking at deregulation and easements within the planning and licensing system, and also for the integration between the two, because what we suffer from at the moment is almost coexistence between business and residential space. And as residential space grows, we've got to learn how we work together, and we need to learn to be able to create the right mitigations to ensure that everyone can mutually enjoy life, whether you want to be at home and in your quiet, safe space with your family, or whether you want to go out and enjoy a night out. And in cities, that's going to become a greater clash. So deregulation is really, really important, particularly a streamlining process, consistency of outcome, and also the integration between planning and licensing so they talk to each other. That's a big issue. The House of Lords did a piece, Sarah Clover and Baroness McIntosh put something very clear that they believe that licensing planning should be integrated at some point. Whether that's a step forward, too far, I don't know. But the reality is I would fully endorse the fact that the relationship needs to be stronger. And I think London, given the density of late night trade and residential spaces that are coming together, particularly with the ambitious position Labour government are taking up in terms of residential spaces, we need to get our house in order pretty quickly. The challenge that we've got is as days move forward and residential spaces are built and the right mitigations aren't in place, we're actually building a legacy of noise complaints and nuisance. So we need to get on top of it very quickly. We talk about the London plan and things like agent of change, but the reality is for it to have really strong teeth, it has to be primary legislation like it is in Scotland. So for me, if I was going to put any recommendations for us, we need to look at approach. We need to look at consistency of outcome, because I'm telling you now, I can put an application for a license in Newcastle and put one in Brighton and get two different outcomes. So that is an issue that in central government needs to be dealt with. So for me, it's really about trying to streamline process, but also the other thing that I think is really important is if we're not going to get any support, we need to allow businesses the opportunity or the fluidity to be able to extend trade, to do more, change use, because then what we're doing is encouraging investment. And that's a really big concern as well. So planning and licensing can work on multiple parts. It can be about coexistence. It can be about investment. It can be about us encouraging people to build and take a chance by streamlining process. It's like planning. Planning can take months. There should be a challenge to local authorities. So planning is those decisions are made quickly, so investment isn't lost off the back of it. And these are all the things that were discussed with DBT in terms of ensuring that we would move forward. And there have been recommendations put forward, and they will be put forward to Labour government as well. So that is in process. It's a big piece of work. It's a big change. But the reality is we need to simplify it, and we need to ensure that investment is something where people aren't losing interest because it's too bureaucratic, as was rightly highlighted. And then over and above that, we need to start to look at coexistence and mitigations to protect everyone within that ecosystem.
Yeah, I just wanted to add the alignment of planning and licensing is a really interesting one. The Mayor already has the London plan. Devolution is potential, opportunity there in terms of strategic alignment of licensing and planning. It's a massive barrier to inward investment. So companies looking to come in overseas are very confused by the complexities of our licensing systems. So having a strategic view on that would be really helpful.
Thank you. Colleagues, just to bring to your attention, we are slightly behind now. So, Assembly Member Clark.
Leave it to me to make up time, Chair. Because actually you've hit on a number of things. So my section refers to long-term challenges, and I think a number of things you've said so far sort of point to what the challenges were, certainly ahead of the pandemic, but also leading up to now. One of them, Simon, really, I can reflect these comments about younger people. I have children in university, and it's the same experience. The experiences I had in university, and it sounds like Alex had in university, there's much more of a drinking at home sort of culture now. And I think that's certainly not just young people, but perhaps people across the ages. And then you said as well, Joan, I thought your observation about 30,000 visitors every single night going to see a theatre show, and then combining that with going out to eat as well. I mean, that's a great package. But I'm just wondering, so I like the phrase big experiences, and that people are sort of saving, money going in for the big experience. But actually, since 2001, between 2001 and 2017, it looks like about a third of pubs and nightclubs in London had gone out of business. What do you put that down to? Do you think that's still big experience, or was that before that trend came in? That's probably for you, Michael. Yeah.
Being really, really honest about it, it's the economics. It's always going to be the economics. The predominance of the issues that we face at the moment is economics. And, whether we talk about at the start of the pandemic, closing down, losing revenue, taking on loans, the likes of... I think it's also proportionality of support. When you talk about a nightclub, we were being funded at the same rate a pub would be for a nightclub, which proportionally had a higher cost base. So it didn't really make sense. What they were doing is a very broad brush hospitality approach, and that didn't really work. We had things like CRF funding, which people benefited from, and there were lots of little pockets of funding. Furlough being a massive thing, as you can appreciate, but it didn't circumvent, particularly for late night economy and nightclubs is where we lost hugely, was that issue. And we're now seeing the real impact of that, because we've seen some 40-odd% of nightclubs disappear from the UK. So, although they have rekindled themselves in different ways and different business models, we've still lost a huge amount of that business category from the sector as a whole.
But as people are changing behaviours, I'm just wondering, maybe this is for you, Simon. As people are changing behaviours and young people drinking less, I mean, that is obviously to be welcomed by society more broadly. How are venues sort of changing their ways to meet the need? Are there things that are happening in London within the sector to attract younger people in who are not drinking?
Yeah, very much so. And I think it's really important that we start to look forward rather than look back. I'm sort of somewhat tired of talking about the pandemic, and hopefully, I think it's very important that people recognise that as an industry we're not through it because of everyone spending cash reserves, and then we went into this cost of living. But I also think it's really important that there's not going to be endless funding. Like, central government is ultimately a business. You guys are a business. You've got to keep to a budget. So you can't just gift money to people forever and ever and ever. What I'm trying to talk about is making improvements of not creating red tape and making it harder, because those are things that you can do, that you can allow a business to save money without actually gifting them money. And the link up between licensing and planning, as Michael said, I think is absolutely critical. We get very different experience, and those departments in local authorities are very separate. But I think culture and us and the theatre industry, all of us just need to understand that there definitely has been a cultural change, and there's been this cultural change through society forever and a day. So people do have to be better. There definitely, sadly, I don't believe, is a place for that traditional nightclub. We are not a nightclub. We spend our lives telling people we are not a nightclub. We are, yes, we put on electronic music, but we put on culturally significant electronic music, and people come and stand and watch rather than drink and interact that way. And that, therefore, we are able to create these sort of moments for people. And that experience needs to filter throughout the industry. I think the days where you could just build a nightclub, open up your doors, and everyone would turn up for a midweek, Thursday, Tuesday, come on a Friday, a bit later, that industry isn't here anymore. And you look at people like Recom as a business and the struggles that they're having, because that's very much their business model. So I don't think it should be about us just sort of here with begging bowls that helping for more and more support. I think there should be some more targeted support, because otherwise you are possibly going to witness the sort of death of the culture industry in its entirety, which would be a very depressing place. But as an industry, it's also equally important that we understand that there is that change, and people need to adapt to that change and be better. And yes, if we have to adapt our business models, we'll do that. The good thing about this industry, and the reason why I enjoy it, is very, very entrepreneurial. So there's no doubt that there will be people who understand and ride that wave. But I think if we're going to survive, we do need to appreciate that the days of going to a high street nightclub have sort of gone. And that's also important from a planning point of view, because you go into a planning team and they will obsess about putting a nightclub in a town centre in a high street, and won't want you to put it in an industrial space, because things like Sills and the London plan all focus on, it has to be industry, But bearing in mind, the town centre nightclub has died. Where does this culture go? Where better to put it? In an industrial warehouse where you've probably got less residential. Yes, I understand transport infrastructure is important, but quite often there is that infrastructure in place. So I think that councils need to learn and adapt to the culture. The industry needs to learn and adapt. And I think the London Assembly, you could lead that, because you're thinking across London. We operate in Manchester as well as London, and to answer that question, it's just entirely different. It's very difficult to consider the two. Manchester's a brilliant council, but it's looking after the size of a very small part of London. But that's where the mayor needs to try and come up with that coordinated approach, bring industry together, bring all the authorities together to come up with something strategic. Don't build loads of houses that aren't soundproofed or don't have the right windows, because all you're going to do is have a backlash of problems in a few years' time. So it's this forward-thinking approach which I think is going to be so important to make sure that this industry doesn't just survive, it flourishes over the next decades.
Right. Thank you.
I mean, one of the big things that we're seeing from venues, whatever size, is the fact that they've got to be multifaceted. You know, in the old days, 13% of the operating hours is where we were looking at Friday and Saturday. While now we're trying to push is 30 to 40% of operational hours. So actually utilising that licence throughout the week. There could be the opportunity for London in particular to look at trying to encourage people to use these spaces more readily for different types of activity. The nightclub of yesterday, or the carpet club as I call them, because it didn't quite work out that dancing would kill the carpet in a couple of years. Carpet club and you know, a dance music venue were two different things. So the carpet club has been sort of reduced and taken away from the high street, but it doesn't take away from it being a multifaceted venue. So I think that's a really, really important thing to consider. There is an evolution. You know, we've seen Revolutions go through a challenging time. We've seen Recom, you know, go through a challenging time. They're now having to revisit and rethink And, day parties are becoming a big piece. So, people are starting to understand, but that's also an adaptation by the market. You're seeing people like Annie Mac doing pre-midnight parties. You're talking about, finishing earlier. To police that is a lot easier if you think about consequentially how you can manage that process. So you can understand why it's easier. People can get home. They're not out until the early hours. So, but it does alter the model of nighttime economy as we would traditionally understand it. Doesn't take away from having late night businesses, but in the same respect, it adds a dynamic and a facet that could potentially aid midweek trading sessions. So I think there's just lots of ways that we can potentially encourage. Particularly, to give you a really simple example, there was some conversations around how do we encourage a nightclub that's only open 2 nights a week to use that space for community-based activity by giving them some sort of incentive financially to drive, or to get rid of some of these spaces that are vacant. How can we get hospitality to use them in a pop-up environment similar to the way that Brick Lane was built? So I think there are lots of options there that gives us possibilities of filling the gaps, but also getting multi-purpose use and encourage people in footfall, because footfall is going to drive more people to come and use the retail services, etc., etc.
Could I just add, so 4.2 million people go to the theatre in the heart of London business area a year. However, the number and variety of places to go after a show is very, very limited. Often nighttime economy is looked at through a negative lens, which is why we did our strategy to see the positives from that economy. It's great that Westminster are now looking at their own strategy, but that has been caused by, in part, through the cumulative impact assessments and the restrictive licensing because of that. So businesses need to have the ability to diversify, and we need to be able to meet that demand with the supply of different activities and a broader, diverse range of activity that goes on post 6 p.m.
Can I just also add something to this discussion, a final point, which is, and I'm going to say theatre, in terms of all-day use, theatre got there first. We've been doing it a long time. I think, again, there is a misunderstanding that theatres are open at night. Our theatres are open all day. We do kids shows in the morning, we have AGMs during the day, we have external rehearsals, we have classes, we have training for the police. They are all-day buildings, and we've been doing that for a long time, and we wouldn't survive commercially if we didn't do that.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Georgiou.
Thank you, Chair. Everything that you've all said, looking at the viability, licensing restrictions, issues around regulation, we've had a record number of businesses within the nighttime economy close over recent years for various different factors. The Mayor and the Night Tsar say that London is leading the way on the nighttime economy. And to keep things brief, as you've all been very, very comprehensive and not been diplomatic, which is good, would it be possible to get a yes or no as to whether you believe London culturally truly is a 24-hour city?
No.
No.
If you speak to anyone out on the street, they will tell you it's not a 24-hour city. It could be, but there's a hell of a lot of infrastructure and market engagement and industry engagement that's going to have to build towards it. But at the moment, by a long way, it's not.
I'm going to say no for obvious reasons. That doesn't particularly impact our business because we're not a 24-hour business, but I would say no too.
No, and I think it's a shame because I think the Night Tsar and that team has got genuine aspiration, and the Mayor has got genuine aspiration for it to be. The last time I was here, we had someone from New South Wales coming and looking at London and going, "Oh, wouldn't it be good to recreate that?" And they're doing better. It's better funded. They're going to be ahead of us very, very quickly. So I think it's really important. If London has an aspiration to be a 24-hour city, it needs looking at strategically and funded, so that the Night Tsar and that team and generally were you able to look at it and actually have an impact?
we're not there yet. I think the Knights Arm and team need appropriate resourcing to help deliver it. We also need the improved infrastructure, an evolved occupier mix, appropriate licensing and policies to enable it. And also it's very important that the Mayor's growth strategy looks in detail to the barriers that across the nighttime industries and unleashes the power that the nighttime can have across the entire 24-hour economy.
Thank you. Assemblymember Bakari. You took my question. That's fine, because actually it was that point that I wanted to make. Michael, in particular, you responded quite quickly after the Mayor did a tweet about the 24-hour city statement that he made after the Knights Are did an interview, and you said, and I quote, "After 11 or past midnight, it's hard to get a drink," and that's because of the infrastructure. So I want you to lengthen on that point. Actually, you can say more.
I think that there are several factors to it now. And I've spoke to a plethora of people, because the one thing that I do is I'm not going to do something off the cuff. I'm going to speak to people in the market and understand what's going on. But the biggest challenge that we've had is, things like the transport infrastructure, particularly midweek. Market has shifted off the back of the pandemic as well. So, let's be honest, and an Australian counterpart said to me, he said, we've spent all our time making sure that you can access your friends at home, you can get your beer or your drinks delivered, you can get your food delivered, you can socialise, you can engage, you can entertain, everything. So getting people to go out again is a big job coming out. I think things like industrial action, particularly in London, has created a lack of confidence in things like public transport infrastructure, particularly that inadequacy of being able to get to and from has created some concerns, and without a doubt the people that I'm speaking to in the industry and consumers that are coming back, some of their biggest concerns is being able to get to and from. Hence the reason midweek people are going home at 11, and if they go home at 11 and the market isn't there, businesses aren't going to stay later because that's a cost they can't recoup in terms of sales. So I think London has not only been subject to a change in behaviour and COVID impacting people's behaviours and going out, but also over and above that, we've been impacted by the cost of operating challenges and the having less disposable income. I was slightly frustrated, I'll be honest with you, with the 24-hour comment, because I sat there and it felt, in all honesty, that there was a disconnect between what was going on the ground and what was going on within the mayoral office. That was the reality. And when I was speaking to people, that fervour and that frustration was resonating. Hence the reason why I brought it out to the public domain, because I think it's important that if there is a disparity between what's going on in office and what's actually happening on the ground, it needs to be brought to light, because it's an important piece. And if we don't recognise the challenges, we can't build the solutions to get past that. And I, without a doubt, and I was one of these people that used to go to Camden Palace and stay out all night and do Sunny Side Up on Sunday and all these sort of things. So for me, I recognise the time when London did have that feel of 24-hour economy, or didn't have the licensing regime for it. So for me, I believe it can be, and I believe with the right infrastructure, it can build towards it. And I do agree with what was said here. It does need the right infrastructure, and we possibly need to revisit the resource and the way that the boroughs work together to start to expand this. But the industry, transport, mayor's office and boroughs have all got to be part of this movement for us to even have the ability to get to 24-hour economy.
A friend of mine who I just mentioned earlier, Paul Kohler, who owns Cellar Door, he's just become an MP for Wimbledon. So you'll be seeing him doing quite a lot of work on this. So please liaise as much as you can with those friendly MPs who are really understanding of what you've just said. But can we come to... yeah, sorry. Sorry, Mark.
Yeah, could I just, add to what Michael was just saying? We've got a scenario in the West End where most of the venues are shutting down 11, 12 o'clock, which is the same time the transport network flips into nighttime mode. So the tubes are shutting down, the bus frequency gets less, people are struggling to get home, then they're staying then on the streets, and then they're becoming victims of crime, which then affects the cumulative impact assessment, and you get into this circular motion of issues. So we do need that appropriate infrastructure and changing to licensing to diversify and take a lot of the heat out of those particular issues.
What reforms would you like to see, Simon? Quite, explicit reforms, if you can think of any that would help the nighttime economy, particularly on licensing.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's interesting to say it's 24-hour. If you tried to apply for a 24-hour licence now, it would be almost impossible to get. So that would be good to look at that more closely. It is very much this coordinated approach. And I can see why Mike particularly would get frustrated, because quite often when you go through licensing or planning, trying to actually get the piece of documentation you need to operate, you sort of get considered a nuisance, and then on the other hand you're sort of heralded as what a wonderful thing this is, and then you go into this sort of regime and everyone's like, oh no, don't want to do that, that's too early, you need to, you can only have this many smokers outside to this time, and it's just this endless thing. So the whole thing needs to be looked at, or there needs to be honesty and go, no, we don't want to be 24-hour. We don't want culture.
Do you think there has to be a similar approach across boroughs? Because you were talking earlier, weren't you, about the different approaches? Do you think that's
because it's really interesting. Licensing and planning, it both comes down really to individuals and what their view of these things are. I've sat in loads and loads of planning things with planners on teams, and they've never even visited the area that we're discussing, and I can be arguing that this is the perfect usage for this place. I can send them endless letters that all the residents have said, yeah, we really like this, but because of policy, which you can't make up in your bedroom without seeing stuff, they will go against it. So it's quite often it doesn't even get to the point of going into committee. It gets sort of tied up in red tape and policy. So it's really, really difficult.
It's not just that, is it? There's that minority of very loud voices that are writing emails to councillors beforehand, before any licensing. Well, I can tell you that happens.
It definitely happens. We had a really unfortunate example of this, and actually Amy and the nighttime team really helped us with this, but we opened our venue just down the road from here in your cultural capital of London, the Beams, next to Tate and Lyle, a massive factory. The venue is between the factory and all of the Ballymore residential, but because of the sill, it seems really important that is retained as some sort of waste recycling centre, which no residents want, Tate and Lyle don't want. It's like an interesting buffer between residential and heavy industry. There's other areas like Walthamstow where they seem to be way more pragmatic, and they're looking at the sill and they're being adaptable. There's loads of microbreweries on Black Horse Lane, and they seem to be able to get through the policy, but in that area that doesn't seem to be a thing, and as a result of that, the residents who we've very closely worked with are lacking a cultural thing. I don't know if many of you have come out of here and walked down to Tate and Lyle. That area at night when it's dark benefits from activity, otherwise you're just lending it to all sorts of way more unscrupulous activity.
I know that we're running out of time, but I just want to tap onto that cultural aspect that you just talked about, and it links to the drinking that we were talking about earlier as well, where the need of adapting. And so the only issue I have with having a blanket approach across all councils is every different area is different, and also the cultural aspect of each area is different. So there might have to be flexibility there. So, for example, I've been contacted by Ealing councillors who have said there's been a real surge of shisha establishments, and they're not popping up on the high street. They're like in these like random industrial estates, and that's causing all sorts of licensing issues, and also residents who are finding like they've moved into this lovely area that was, a newly built area for them, and now there's this noisy shisha, lots of car revving and all sorts of... So we have got a challenge here.
I think it's really important, and the last thing I want is an unregulated environment, because actually that does more harm to us than good. We can invest lots and lots of money, be operationally brilliant, and if someone round the corner is making noise, it just reflects badly on everybody. And it is very important that locally there is a view on this. My main thing would say is licensing works much better than planning, and I get it, because planning is a forever thing and licensing can be more greatly enforced against. But I think if you just connected those two things up a bit better, I think licensing on the whole works, apart from the fact that you can't be 24 hours if you have to close at 1 o'clock. So that bit maybe needs looking at. But I'm all for regulation, but a more pragmatic approach to it.
I know, Chair, that you want to wrap up, but can we make a final point of what the Mayor and the Knights could be doing to help, or are you happy with that? You want to end?
We are very behind Assemblymember Bakari, if you don't. And I'm aware Assemblymember Small-Edwards, you wanted to come in as well, but forgive me, we are actually very behind at the moment. Can I then, to wrap up this first section, thank you all, Michael Kill, Joan Moynihan, Simon Tracy and Mark Williams as our first panel this morning, and for your incredibly interesting answers. And we're now going to allegedly adjourn for 5 minutes before welcoming our new guest, but I do really want to do this photo, so if everyone could just hold their bladders for a second. We have a photo there in front of that, the bit there that says London Assembly, the screen, and then we will reconvene, shall we say 11:30? Yeah, at 11:30. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think for us, we're Camden, so we are very well known for our kind of, evening and nighttime entertainment industry, but also just generally being a home of culture, and that's why I'm so lucky and honoured to have the role. So I've sat on licensing committee for the whole time I've been a councillor, so I've sort of seen the trade-offs and the discussions that have to be had, and it can be difficult at times. If you've all been lucky enough to ever be at Camden Lock or the centre of Camden Town, you can see it is very, very busy and very vibrant, but we also have lots of residents kind of sometimes above venues, above shops, and also on the side streets. So while those trade-offs are difficult, I think we do our best to hear from residents, but also put it in the context of our history and culture and the benefits it brings. We have lots and lots of our residents who work in the sector, and having a vibrant sector is important for them and their careers and their livelihood, but also we do expect venues to be run with respect and to also, listen to us and to make sure that their patrons leave quietly, respectfully, and are not having too much of a detrimental effect on our residents.
Thank you. Second question is to Sophie. Sophie, do you think that local authorities currently have a good understanding of the nighttime economy and the contribution that they make to their local areas?
Thank you. I think there's been a big improvement over the last sort of 10 years in how much these issues are understood, and certainly things like licensing are in a much better place than they previously were. It's really different both between boroughs but also within boroughs themselves. So often we will see a very inconsistent approach even across a borough and within a council. And I'm not trying to give you a confusing answer on that, it's just the venue's experience of dealing with councils sometimes. So for instance, we've had occasions where one arm has actively undone positive work that another arm of a borough might be doing, and that can be quite confusing for venues, and it can be quite detrimental as well. So for example, one council developed a fantastic initiative to get locals to venues through discounted tickets, and venues got funding for that. But then while one part of the council was channeling those funds, another part of the council denied temporary event notices for that same period, and for venues specifically putting on those events. So that can be really difficult and confusing. To give another example is the approach when GMVs can apply for local discretionary grants for business rates if they're non-profits, and then some community interest companies have been given that discretionary rate relief, but others aren't within the same borough, and there doesn't seem to be a consistent approach applied to that, which can be really difficult for venues. We also see many instances where actual personnel on the ground are approaching and dealing with venues very differently. So environmental health officers, for example, just their actual attitude can be really different. And it might be the same role, the same borough, but just an entirely different approach. So venues don't always know what they're working with and what they're dealing with. I would say, on the other hand, we experience fantastic dedicated work from councillors across all boroughs. And I'd say for Islington example, their team who handle licensing, it's absolutely fantastic, and we really appreciate their advice and guidance for venues.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Giorgio.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you really, Sabrina and Sophie, for your comments. Sabrina in particular, before we had kids, Electric Ballroom, Mrs. G and I used to attend frequently. But so. Yeah, I know. Anne and I have got to talk about our histories many nighttime venues. So sorry, this for you, Sophie. So many nighttime venues only come to life after 10 to 11 p.m. And this comes back to your point of, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing when it comes to local authorities. Yet many local authorities will only grant licences to this time. So in terms of what this place can do, and the mayor and the Knights are, how would you see their interventions working within that sort of sphere, and saying to the local authorities, right, can you sort of get... Now, the mayor doesn't have statutory powers over licensing, but in terms of getting that to work a bit better, what do you think the GLA could do?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we'd like a much greater understanding of the minor variations that venues might ask for within licensing. So generally that's looking at midnight onwards, and it's often those hours that can really support the loss-making hours that are 7 to 11. And while it might just look like it's supporting alcohol-driven sales. It is the difference between a venue's financial viability and it's surviving, and 55% UK-wide of all our venues and our emergency response service are in there for financial reasons. So, GMVs provide models for encouraging a well-managed, healthy drinking culture. They often have best practice security baked in, and licensing works best when they understand why a late night establishment might need minor variations, temporary events notices, because that can really help them to thrive in their area. So I think it would be really helpful for us if boroughs and councils had a greater, more consistent approach and that understanding of why those variations are needed and why venues might be applying for them. I think a sort of London-wide approach to licensing is very difficult. We understand why local variations are needed, and we appreciate that something you might want to see in the middle of Hackney is not appropriate in the centre of Bromley, and we really wouldn't encourage that kind of approach. But what we would like to see is an approach built around the basic concept that live music is good for our communities, it's good for mental health, it's good for young people, it's good for access to culture. So what we would really like to see is there being agreement from the start that music is a good thing and that our approach to licensing should be built on that, but we don't think that should detract from a local approach for councils to take.
Thank you. Assembly Member Bakari.
Yeah, just to carry on from that point, I think that an excellent point that you just made, and I think from the Mayor's perspective, there could be an amplification on that particular issue of making the nighttime economy such an attractive thing that could perhaps go across to residents who are constantly complaining as well. And is there any way that you think that the Mayor could perhaps try and support resident associations in particular who seem to kind of go on this mission to quiet down local areas more than anything else? That's the experience I think a lot of councillors have. Is there anything that the Mayor could be doing to kind of counter that approach that most of the councillors seem to be getting?
Yes, I think we really support a lot of the work the Mayor has done on the nighttime economy. We think he's been a fantastic advocate for nighttime economy and for live music venues generally. I think some of the initiatives councils have taken, like the early warning on noise complaints for venues in Hackney, has been really, really helpful for venues. I don't think there's anything specific that we would ask for from the Mayor. I think certainly more powers could go to someone like the Night Tsar to improve that role. But I think that Sorry, just repeat the question for me.
Well, I mean, it's interesting you just said powers to the Night Tsar, because, it's quite clear that there are restrictions to that role. Is that something that we need to start thinking about in terms of, is there a need for a different type of role or a different position so that there is more powers?
So we don't think it's a different position per se, but we were part of the report that recommended the role of a Night Tsar. And at the time, we advocated for the Night Tsar having more powers. Right. So we, for example, would like to see them being able to lift parking restrictions so musicians can unload to venues safely and effectively and without hampering local residents. So we don't think it's a different role. We just think that there could be more budgetary powers. There could be the power to summon people to meetings. So we just think that role could be expanded. But we appreciate that is considering a different type of role for the Night Tsar.
She's an officer. The Night Tsar is an officer at the moment. So therefore, is that the change you're looking for? Maybe.
I think it would require a greater consultation on what the role could cover, but we fully support the role of the Night Tsar at the moment, and we think they've been a great help. The only thing I would add to your previous question about what more the Mayor could do is that music tourism is increasing. It's up to 6.9 million music tourists this year, which is up from 2022, and that goes the same for the increased spend people spend on music tourism, and it also includes the number of people employed. So that appetite is really there. I think when you're talking about noise complaints, a lot of it can be to do with new developments where people aren't aware of that they're moving into next to a music venue, and that has a lot to do with how agent of change is applied by councils. It's obviously currently guidance in the NPPF. We would advocate for a much greater understanding and proper enforcement of that on the ground from councils. And on a national level, we would like to see it enforced on a statutory level, and we would like to see developers take control of their buildings and apply greater soundproofing as well.
I think I'm going to stop there because I might be going into other questions right now. Thank you, Assemblymember Bakari. Next is Assemblymember Small-Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. My first question is to Sabrina, and it's just about what actions you've taken in Camden to better support and grow your nighttime economy there.
We see it as incredibly important, and actually kind of recently worked on an evening and nighttime entertainment strategy, and that was a big piece of work for us. We kind of wanted to take residents with us on the journey, so we did big citizens' assemblies. It was 3 Saturdays in a row. We had 55 residents, which were kind of representative of the borough, come and speak to us about their ideas and their plans and what they thought we could do. And it kind of goes back to the previous question, actually, that it can feel like sometimes residents are complaining, but we found people had a really, really nuanced understanding of their borough. People were incredibly excited to live in Camden, but they still were like, we don't like it if people leave mess in our front garden. So if you're going to expand hours, can you think about the cleaning? And those things are things that are easily connected and easily done. And then we also had big conversations about, after work hours. So we think of night as obviously those very financially important hours, but there's all that time before. So how can venues start to make more money then? And I have the culture brief, so I think about museums and galleries. If we put those in that bucket as well, how do we create a whole vibrant kind of sector for all of it? So hopefully out of all of this work there will be more support, because we had people from the venues in the conversation as well with residents, so it just was a far richer conversation. Obviously, when they are at risk, so we have had some kind of COVID difficulties where venues couldn't necessarily pay back the loans or the rental kind of stoppages they had, they're now facing having to pay them back. As councillors, we support them as much as we can, and the Night Tsar has been part of those campaigns as well, because we just know it is really, really hard, and they are some of our smaller pubs that were kind of granted little breaks in their rental, and then now suddenly they've got to pay it all back and they're finding it really hard. And then also working with communities, because they can tell us what venues are important to them and why. What is just looks like a pub to you might be a place where they do mothers and baby sessions upstairs, or they might have theatre upstairs. It's being far more broad about what these venues mean to communities, and then listening to them when they come to us, and then kind of helping them with their campaigns and asset of community value and all of that stuff as well.
Thank you very much. And to Ben and Sophie, you kind of touched on this a bit earlier, but I just want to get your thoughts on a kind of more uniform licensing approach London-wide, the potential advantages and disadvantages of that, and then also the link, because we heard this a lot on the previous panel about the link between planning and licensing, and whether you think there should be kind of more integration with that.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question and topic. I think in the LGBT venue space, which is what I've mainly looked at in my research, I think a more sort of holistic approach across the capital would be really helpful, as long as it's one which kind of recognises the particularities of how particularly late-night club spaces serve marginalised communities as spaces of, not just leisure, which is what this committee is named, but also of well-being, of livelihoods, of creative production, of music, of all of those things. So I think that could be really helpful, and I think speaking to venue operators, they would welcome that. Obviously those scenes are very specific and not spread completely throughout the city, but there are lots of those venues across the city. I think in my research I've also looked at a lot of cases of planning contestations that have involved LGBT spaces, and I think the Mayor and the Night Tsar and the 24-hour team have been incredibly helpful in kind of producing better outcomes from some really difficult conflicts, as well as the local authorities. So one of those being the Black Cap in Camden, which is a very long-term venue. There's now been a 10-year campaign to kind of bring it back into use for LGBT communities, and I think that's showing that we need planning, but we need planning tools that actually empower local authorities to be able to protect nighttime venues when they're serving these very specific and multiple uses for particular communities. So, things like using ACV that's a really interesting one. I don't know whether you're going to come on to that later, but I think that tool's been really helpful, and a lot of labour by communities has gone into using that tool. But at the end of the day, it has to be renewed every 4 years. It's not really securing venues in the long term in the way that it might have been imagined to work. So it requires a lot of kind of capital in order to be able to protect venues using that instrument. So perhaps I'll pass to Sophie.
Yeah, I think we'd agree with the holistic approach that Ben mentioned. I already spoke about how we'd like it to be based on the approach that live music is a good thing. And like Sabrina said as well, these places provide focus points for communities that bring people together, whether they are mothers with children, whether they are young people, whether they are people with mental health problems or financial problems. They can be a real lifeline for people in their communities. So we would like licensing to take an approach that understands that and values that. I would also say we'd like to see some other top-down initiatives, like the business-friendly licensing fund, which has been used really innovatively by some councils. So one council created a dedicated cultural nighttime focus within their licensing and environmental health, so not working in those silos, but bringing together departments and weaving that in with best practice training, outreach to venues, and then that feeding into their nighttime strategy. So we'd really like to see more initiatives like that, because we think councils use them really well.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Bakari.
This is a question to Professor Campkin. The work that you've done, I'd like to know, particularly on the work that you focused on after the pandemic and the perceptions that people have of the city after the pandemic. Now, there was a lot of al fresco dining and a different style that was developing during the pandemic. Has that perception of the city changed at all? And do you think that councils have been realistic about kind of having a more relaxed approach when it comes to licensing because of the experience since the pandemic?
Excuse me, sorry. It's not something that I've looked at in detail in my research, but it has obviously, so I'm doing a piece of work currently on night workers' experiences, not just around venues, but my research on LGBT venues was mainly focused around 2016, and I've continued doing research, but and have looked with others around the impacts of the pandemic. So there was a really important piece of work on queer creatives' experiences through the pandemic. Also just kind of keeping in touch with my research contacts. I think, that kind of flexibility that happened around the pandemic and those support structures that were enacted, such as the Cultural Recovery Fund, were really, really important, but they were obviously quite piecemeal and not kind of evenly distributed across the whole landscape of venues. I think what comes up in my research is that there's, especially in the LGBT space, there's kind of more formal licensed venues, but if you just look at those, you're only looking at a very tiny amount of the really vibrant cultural nightlife scenes that happen more informally and move around between different venues and so on. So I think those types of venues and clubs were offered less support during the pandemic, whereas these kind of flexibilities around sort of allowing outside use of spaces and food to be served and those kinds of things were beneficial to a certain set of venues, and that was really important. But I think moving forward, sort of being able to recognise this kind of broader landscape of night scenes that is harder to capture in terms of data, but is really vital and really culturally productive, where actually some of the most precarious workers are. So there's a lot of livelihood sustained by those types of scenes, but they're not kind of stable, secure livelihoods. So being able to invest in helping venues to develop people's kind of cultural careers and trajectories within those spaces, I think is something that's really important for the future.
Assembly Member Giorgio.
That's fine. It's been covered, Chair.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Clark.
Yes, Sabrina. Sorry, I'll come back to you. So you touched on this about having more powers for the Night Tsar, but I'm just wondering, from City Hall, from both the Mayor and the Night Tsar, what do you think more could happen in order to support boroughs, both your culture offer, but certainly the nighttime economy as well?
I think it is hard because obviously, you know, everyone has the powers they have, and you know, licensing committee in some ways works because you are in the community and residents know where to find you if they believe that you've, you know, been far too lenient with your venues. But I think it is about some of that support, and I think Sophie kind of touched on it, you know, visibly supporting and showing that we believe that these venues are important. I guess it's, you know, all that sort of London is open stuff and making people feel proud to be the home of culture. Like, it takes a bit of a mind shift for some people, particularly if you're someone who feels that your life is detrimentally affected by it. But I do think it is that positioning and messaging and being proud of what we do. Whenever we want, you know, direct help, it has come for us. And, you know, some of the cases I mentioned about pubs being at risk because of having to pay back rent and stuff, actually having, you know, the Night Tsar on the campaign or it being mentioned or noticed also helps, because you just need to get eyeballs on the campaign sometime and get names on petitions. So some of the kind of practical help has been useful as well. But I do think you're right, and it is about creating a culture where we say loudly and proudly we are the home of, you know, great music and great venues, and that is something we are proud of, but also obviously taking into account that the venue should be, you know, well run and safe.
Yeah, of course. Do you have anything else to add to that, Sophie?
I think I would just say that in our experience, the Mayor generally, but also more broadly, the culture community spaces at risk team, the cultural team, and the Night Tsar, we feel are all really keenly aware of the issues that grassroots music venues and the sector more broadly are facing. And we think they are doing as much as they can within their direct power to do that, and they are trying to influence the right people. A lot of the issues are national issues, and a lot of the short-term symptoms are long-term, but we do feel they're doing everything they can.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are now moving on to our specific questions about LGBTQ plus and grassroots music venues. So I'm going to ask Assembly Member Polanski to start.
Thank you, Chair. Ben, so I spoke to the previous panel. I mentioned that I was a former actor. I was also a former nightclub worker. The two things often go hand in hand. And I was thinking about the places I've worked, and I've worked at the Astoria, the Den, Sin, Ghetto, Barcode, Pendulum. All have now shut down, which I'm sure you'll be very aware of. I realise I'm the consistent factor in all of them shutting down. But also, the other consistent factor is that they were redeveloped. How much of a problem has redevelopment been in LGBT IQA venues?
So yeah, in the research that I did, it showed very clearly that in 2006 to 8 and the middle of the 2010s, a lot of venues were impacted by large-scale transport infrastructure redevelopment in King's Cross particularly, and around the Tottenham Court Road redevelopment for Crossrail. And I think what was interesting there was that there were equalities impact assessments in place by the time of the Crossrail one, not by the time of the King's Cross redevelopment, because the law had changed. So there was an equalities impact assessment, but it only really captured the surface of what was happening. So it did actually capture the fact that the Astoria was closing, and there was some attempt to kind of move GAY nightclub, probably the most successful commercial brand amongst LGBT venues, to a different location. So that was good, and that was the first time I think that the Mayor's office intervened when there was a public campaign that had already started. It was the first time people were really using online tools to draw attention to this. But what that impact assessment missed was there were lots of other venues kind of maybe not right in the zone of the development, maybe just on the edge, some really important, vital community spaces like First Out Cafe, multi-purpose, really innovative venue, the first cafe to open as an LGBT space, you know, not to be a kind of shuttered, closed space, but actually kind of welcoming in the bus drivers from Central Station and so on. So it was really important as a multi-purpose venue, but they really struggled in that context to keep that space going, despite having a lot of community support. So obviously there are lots of reasons why venues close, and venues have always opened and closed, and I think it's really important that the Mayor's office are now keeping the data that we collated and then passed to them in 2016, and they're annually reviewing that data. It's only licensed venues, so it does only capture that surface, but it is important to do that. And it's important also to look really at the fluctuations. So we might have a consistent figure around 50 or so venues. That's been quite consistent, but venues might be opening and closing underneath that total, and so we might need to understand why that is. And there are obviously lots of specific reasons, and often personal reasons, often reasons that are quite difficult to ascertain, but urban development, and particularly a kind of internationally, globally kind of fueled, financed, real estate-led form of infrastructure and housing development has definitely had a really negative impact. And it's not spaces that have closed because they haven't been popular. They've closed at the time of the highest popularity, and so I think that's why the Joiners Arms campaign, which is still receiving support to try and reopen a space, is really innovative. And I think it's a shame that these campaigns have had to take so long, but I think there is still hope. And I think because of the interventions that have been made, London is a really great model now of using it's the planning tools, but it's also supplementing the planning tools, because if you just use them crudely, they don't capture things. So it's it is the asset of community value. It is making sure Section 106 is enacted. It is kind of drawing attention to the value of these spaces and learning from communities in doing that, because I think these planning contestations kind of brought to the surface some of the historic reasons these venues have been important, but also why they're important now as a kind of living heritage, why they're supporting people, their health, their education, when they're marginalised, why they're valuable now.
That actually links to my next question nicely. So I'm one of the founding directors of the Save a Black Cap campaign. There was about 5 or 6 of us initially 10 years ago that started that campaign. I remember at one point during the campaign we were talking about it not necessarily being a pub, but actually starting to be an LGBT community space. And you talk about the First Out Cafe, and I remember going back there decades ago and going to an HIV education workshop that was there. How important are these spaces for marginalised groups to come together as a collective space?
Yes, so I think what's really important is that the kind of crisis over spaces closing led to a kind of public conversation and professional planning, policymaker conversation around what these spaces were doing above and beyond the leisure uses. And it did bring to the surface that actually, if you look at, I think there's one LGBT space that's operated by a person of colour. The demographics of venue ownership is one thing that's quite difficult to trace often. The demographics of venue operation, so the people that are just running venues, are very narrow, especially when you consider London's diversity, when you consider the diversity of LGBTQ communities. And I do think that there is a really ever more nuanced understanding of that diversity within policy discussions, that LGBT is not one group, that it's actually a very plural group, and I think that's really important. So I think that from those crises, there have been a lot of campaigns that have been pushing for more community-oriented space, and that is speaking to this kind of broader shift that's happening culturally around, moving from an alcohol profit-centred model to a more community-centred model. A lot of the most interesting spaces that are opening now or running now are run by collectives. It's quite a politicised kind of form of nightlife scene. Also, I think one thing that's really great is that there have been some LGBT community centres specifically that have opened. I know that they're not necessarily nighttime spaces, but that's definitely come from this discussion around and crisis around the availability of spaces within LGBT communities. And I think that was kind of, we had the London Lesbian and Gay Centre in the 1980s to the 90s. That was really important, but it was closed down as the funding was withdrawn. So I think that really left a gap, and that's started to be filled now through these new community centres.
That's a really interesting point about intersectionality too and the spaces. Recent GLA data shows that the number of LGBTQ venues has now seems to have stabilised. Do you think this is the consequence of any particularly local or national policy?
Local, definitely. I think we wouldn't have even had that number previously. So I think the fact that it's being maintained is great. It does only show one type of venue, and it is difficult to define an LGBT venue because obviously there's lots of venues that host multiple groups. I would like to see, it's difficult to do, but I think we need to audit those other spaces as well, and I think we need to kind of broaden the data that we have available to make those assessments. So, yeah, I definitely do think the figures have stabilised. Some spaces have closed. Some important spaces are still threatened or not yet opened, like the Black Cat, Royal Vauxhall Tavern. I think it's going to be really important. There are some spaces that have particular value because of their history within LGBT struggle, but also because of their current importance to those communities. So I think, yeah, it's a positive story that the figures have stabilised, and there's definitely interesting new ones that have opened and a broadening out of what the kind of business model is. And I think that's all really positive.
Thank you. And how helpful have the Mayor and the Night Tsar been in protecting LGBT spaces? And what more do you think they could be doing?
I mean, I think the Mayor has been a really great advocate for LGBT communities and spaces, and you've definitely seen an upturn in the type of engagement and the meaningfulness of engagement with LGBT communities. So things like reinstating the Pride reception that happens every year, setting up the LGBT Venues Forum. I think there is a space for a similar group who are event promoters and producers in the future, and supporting. I know that the Night Tsar has also been really important in using their convening power within particular planning situations, and I think that is the power that they have, and it is about a kind of educating really. That role is not just happened in London; it's happened in other cities too, and I think the fact that often the Night Tsar or Night Mayor in other cities comes from a kind of grassroots background, and I think that's been important because it is complicated to engage with grassroots cultural venues or marginalised communities, and to understand what's happening intersectionally amongst complex communities. So I think that the work that they've done, and the work they've done more generally around women's safety at night, I think what we've seen is a kind of shift from a kind of narrow understanding of a nighttime economy to thinking more about nighttime economy and culture. And I think that, the London plan, even since 2000, named LGBT venues as a type of social infrastructure, but it's really only in the last kind of administration that we've seen any kind of action on that, and these spaces don't survive without intervention in this context of kind of rapid redevelopment, in my view, from the research that I've done.
That's helpful, thank you. I also celebrate the Pride reception, but if I can be political for a second, I also celebrate that United Airlines have been dropped as a main sponsor, which is an argument I had with the Mayor several times in public, and I know Fossil Free Pride talk a lot about the fact that our LGBT community should not be pinkwashed. You mentioned other cities or countries that have done good jobs of protecting LGBT spaces. One thing you said was having someone who's genuinely grassroots and making sure that's amplified. Is there anything else they've been doing from your research that you think we could learn from?
I think we should be making more of the work that's been done in London, actually, because I think it is really innovative in terms of the collaborations that have happened between quite radical grassroots groups, venue operators, policymakers, planners, looking across the board of the different people that have been involved in these different contexts. A lot of people have put a lot of energy into trying to create a more positive outcome. So I think we should make more of that. I don't see that happening in other cities, and I do think other cities are interested. I've certainly been invited to talk about what's happening in London in different places, and there are some comparabilities in Sydney, for example, where there are similar kind of campaigns to protect heritage, really important heritage cultural LGBT venues. I think, there's definitely more that can be done, and I think having an international channels for sharing that work is really, really important.
Thank you. And just a final question. It's two themes I didn't know I'd ever be talking about at the London Assembly, which is drag queens and Grindr. With drag queens, in the time that I was working at the Black Cat, we were often promoting local drag, and that was artists who were on the local scene kind of really making their money. And then RuPaul's Drag Race came out, and you kind of had these huge international queens. But it felt to me, and just interesting if there's research around this, that negatively impacted some of those local drag queens because suddenly everyone wanted the famous drag queen from the TV. And the second thing is just what role has apps played in the removal of our kind of LGBT spaces?
Okay, so when I started doing my research in around 2015, there was a very strong media line about why venues were closing, which was that technology is replacing them. Apps are replacing them. People don't meet up in bars anymore. I didn't find that to be the case at all, and of course people use apps to then meet in bars, and there's always been a relationship between venues and technology, which means that venues have always extended their reach. So that was really important in the 80s for using radical and DIY print cultures to disseminate ideas about rights. I think technology, we saw during the pandemic that actually the venues were using technology in really interesting ways themselves to extend their reach and to make sure people that were really suffering during the pandemic because to stay at home wasn't a safe space for them, were still being able to access the kind of services that they put on. So we saw some really innovative spaces appearing during the pandemic through technology. So I think it's very one-sided just to say, especially to say one app, which is actually mainly used by gay men, I guess. I don't know, haven't done research on that, but is replacing people's desire to meet in physical spaces. It seems there are a lot of kind of causal arguments around why spaces were closing, and I just don't think I buy any of those. There's always a complexity of different factors happening that you need to look at. Drag queens, no, I'd say the opposite was true. So in the case of the Black Cat, just before it closed, when it had just become actually more popular than it had been for ages in its decades-long history, they were actually showing RuPaul's Drag Race in the cabaret space, and there were a whole set of young generation who were kind of enjoying reinventing a scene around that. So yeah, I don't think one thing is replacing the other. I do think it shows that there is now a kind of global LGBT culture and global activism, and I think looking at how London connects into those translocal activisms around rights in different parts of the world, particularly in places that used to be British colonies and have very punitive laws against LGBT people. I think there's, looking at that kind of reach of London through venues and through the cultures that appear around them is interesting area for new research.
Thank you very much. Sophie, can I pivot to you on a new subject? So data from the Music Venue Trust shows that financial viability is the main reason for grassroots venues closing. Do you think this is due to recent rises in inflation, or is it more of a long-term issue?
Yeah, so as I said before, I think a lot of the short-term symptoms and challenges that we see are linked to longer-term issues. So nationwide, 55% of the logged cases that we have in our emergency response service are to financial viability issues, and I would say the same goes for across London as well. So ultimately venues are closing because the costs of presenting you an original live music vastly outweighs the possible income that can be derived from doing it. And that is due to a number of challenges. It is not because people don't want to see live music. As I said, the number of music tourists are up, and attendance at venues is up, but the amount of money isn't. So some of those challenges are due to rising rents. They are due to business rates costs. We have the highest VAT in Europe on tickets. Even American states are cutting deals for VAT on tickets to try and alleviate some of the pressures on grassroots music venues. And a lot of the current planning issues that we're seeing, they may not be closing venues now, but we are concerned that in 3 to 5 years' time, those campaigns will run out, those issues will deepen, and those venues will have to close. So those are some of the long-term challenges that we're seeing. And without resolving those long-term challenges, we have a long-term economic model that isn't really sustainable.
Thank you. In terms of solutions, there's been a campaign to suggest that there could be a levy on some of the huge commercial venues to pay for the grassroots venues. So, for instance, a £1 levy on each ticket that goes straight back to grassroots music. Where would you stand on this?
Yeah, so we absolutely support this initiative, and it's one of the proposals that we have pioneered and we are consistently advocating for on a national level. We are getting support from other local authorities in the UK and Wales and Scotland as well, who are looking to support this, and we would like to see it implemented on a voluntary but blanket level by the industry as soon as possible.
Thank you. And do you know if there's been any conversations with the Mayor's Office or the GLA team around this idea of a levy?
So I believe it has come up, but I wouldn't be able to speak to what was in those conversations as I wasn't in them.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Giorgio.
Thank you, Chair. Ben, you mentioned EQIA statements, particular to licensing committees. Now, one of my personal biggest frustrations is that no matter when an EQIA says it harms a particular protected community, it harms the LGBT community, elderly community, those for minorities, always seems to get ignored. That councils always find a way to say, yes, all of these are big issues, but we're going to do what we're going to do anyway. So in terms of your experience of using EQIA statements, how do you think the legislation around that can be toughened up and utilised by, perhaps not members of the administration, but backbench councillors that want to get more involved and protect a particular site?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think in my research, one thing that's come up is that the legislation and the categories in use for protected characteristics are very crude, and when you try to use those to actually think about the lived experiences of people that are affected by regeneration, then they have a very limited use. And so with LGBT groups, if you look at the diversity and the way that those communities actually talk about identity and marginalisation or minoritization, it's much more nuanced than the legislation captures. And so the legislation kind of pushes you to think of different groups of people in different categories as bounded things, whereas actually I think what's happening in London is a greater awareness of the power of thinking intersectionally about how people's lived experiences are navigated across different forms of discrimination and minoritization. So I think that's one thing that could change, the kind of learning around and shifts in the way that we talk about identity categories and protected categories. I mean, that comes up in other regeneration contexts as well. So I've looked at, housing estate redevelopment, for example. Similar issues come up there. And I think when the Equalities Act has been brought to the table in planning contexts around LGBT spaces. So another example, I mentioned Tottenham Court Road, but another example is the Black Cap in Mile End, which was a very long-term venue, London's last leather bar, where the developer, in their first submission, sort of pretended that the club that has been there for over 30 years didn't exist and that there was just a derelict club there. And then when forced to actually articulate that there was a club there, just kind of pushed that Equalities Act. The planners attempt to use that, kind of push that away and said, well, these communities are served by X, Y, and Z other spaces in the local vicinity. That was, not true at all, because there was a very particular clientele linked to that venue, and it is also a very international clientele, but also kind of quite important for a particular generation. So, yeah, that was an interesting case where all of these different planning tools kind of came. The planners at Tower Hamlets were trying to use all of the different tools and legislation available to them, and they did get the planning inspector at the inquiry to make some concessions, but it was difficult. Yeah, so it showed again, I think, that the tools are often quite blunt.
So just to summarise that,
yeah.
You agree that EQIA statements are ignored, pretty much.
I mean, that's. I think I would need to do more research to make that statement as a kind of broad brush statement. I think in the context that I've looked at, they haven't been ignored, but they've had limited value in application because they are arguments are made around the interpretation of that legislation.
Thank you. And my last question on this section, I've you know, within your judgment, between the three of you, and all three of you don't need to respond, just thinking about time, there's been some praise with regard to the mayor and the Night Tsar with regard to LGBT venues. But I'm slightly confused about that simply because there's been a drastic reduction in the number of LGBT venues. Now, I've read some of your work, Ben, on the previous mayoralty under Boris Johnson, in which there were also significant closures of LGBT venues. So I'm trying to sort of square the circle and understand how can we have praise for whichever administration it is when there's still been significant closures for various factors. I'm just trying to understand that.
I mean, so I think the figures have stabilised since Sadiq Khan was elected, and I do think the instruments that have been activated and the discourse around kind of raising awareness of what these venues are in development context with developers, so working like through the LGBT Venues Charter. Again, it's quite a crude definition, but it helps to work with different professionals in built environment context to get them to kind of understand what an LGBT venue is. So I do think all of those tools have had positive impacts. I think that this work did start before Sadiq Khan. Actually, Boris Johnson supported the Royal Vauxhall Tavern campaign, and it was under Boris Johnson that the Music Venues Trust did their amazing rescue report, which really raised the value of music venues, not just for their intrinsic kind of cultural value, but also for their research and development value and kind of innovating as cultural spaces. And I think that work, since then, there's been a kind of gradual learning around these venues, and that work did start under Boris Johnson. I say that in my book. Yeah.
Sorry, and final point, but in one of your papers, and I think as an assembly, we also need to get our stats right. Not saying that we get it wrong, but in one of your papers, you mention a number of, I think, 58% closure over a certain time period. But then you also go on to say that these weren't really closures. They happened to change names. They happened to, go from a nighttime venue to a daytime venue, various sorts of things. So do you think there is one way that we can collate, the number of LGBT venues in London and to properly assess what's actually happening to them, rather than saying, X, Y, and Z, which doesn't always happen to be the case?
These figures are always a barometer. I still feel very confident. I published the figure of 58% within the decade from 2006. I published that figure, and I stand by that figure as the most secure figure really that you can get to because of the complexity of counting venues. It's easier, it's more difficult than it seems, but I think that figure is broadly correct. Actually, there's a section in the book that I published since then, I published last year, which describes since the 1980s what the pattern has been. So I would like to see us developing ways of assessing more broadly the kind of health of nighttime scenes and venues, and I think we can do that in a joined up way. I think it was really important to bring that 58% figure into the discussion around the number of clubs that were closing, the number of pubs that were closing. Obviously, a lot of the issues are interrelated, even if there are specific issues around LGBT heritage and livelihoods bound into LGBT venues and night scenes. So I think that was important, and I think that figure was as accurate as you can get, really, and it is. Even when we published it, we said it's a kind of barometer figure, and that's what those figures allow you to do. It's slightly disappointing that actually the media coverage just focused on that rather than the more qualitative research that was evidencing the multiple uses of these venues and the multiple things that can be done to support them and the ways that they are producing kind of globally innovative culture and those kinds of things. Fixating on the percentage doesn't really get us anywhere, I don't think.
Thank you. Assembly Member Bakari.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to mention Boris Johnson again, actually. It was under his mayoralty in 2015 that the Grassroots Music Venue Task Force was set up, and the recommendations for the Night Tsar was one of the recommendations that was incorporated by the next mayor. And the purpose of it was to be an agent of change, particularly for grassroots music venues. So, Sophie, do you think that was accomplished? Did the Night Tsar become an agent for change?
Yes, as I said before, we feel really supported, heard and seen by the Night Tsar. We understand that there has been some criticism of the Night Tsar from other areas, but we think it's criticism for things that is not actually within their power. We think they're taking as much direct action as they can, and that they're trying to influence the right people. And we certainly feel really supported in the Night Tsar's work, and the kind of direct support that we have had from her. We would certainly support giving them more powers or a bigger budget, but I think that requires rethinking about what a Night Tsar is permitted to do and what we want from that role.
And you have mentioned earlier about wanting to see those powers extended. Councillor Francis, you've also talked about your own experiences within your own borough. What action are you currently taking to protect some of the cultural venues that are at risk within your area?
I think for us, it is always a challenge because there are just some things that are out of our control. I think, we've talked about some of the things that cause venues to shut or be at risk, but also it's things like energy prices and all of that stuff. So there is kind of only so much we really can do. But as I say, we are really, really open to hearing from those venues and also supporting the ones we can and, promoting them how we can. It's interesting to hear the conversation about venue shutting. So we have, famously the Black Cap shut, but we've had a new LGBT venue open in the last couple of years. I was lucky enough to open it when I was mayor. It was great, it settled in really quickly and grew a community around it. So sometimes it's even that stuff, like having the mayor go and open a new LGBT venue to show that we support them and we support our community is a really visible thing. And it's kind of, I think, having to be a little bit clever about what you can do, because there's no way we can bail out every single failing venue, but we absolutely join the campaigns, show they're visibly important. We have culture as a portfolio. We do as much as we can and sing from the rooftops that Camden really is a place for music and culture and entertainment and LGBT communities.
What did the mayor and the Night Tsar do to support you in those particular initiatives?
I know the Night Tsar and the mayor were really active in, Altanet is just on our border, and there's a venue there, and there's also, we have sort of Tin Pan Alley, and there's another venue there, and when they were kind of coming in, we had lots of support, particularly because I think we had some residents that weren't necessarily used to there being a bit of hustle and bustle there, because there'd been a bit of a gap in the time, and that's often the thing we face, which connects to the point about planning. Sometimes if a site hasn't been used for a while, residents forget that there used to be a venue there, or that it's famous for something, or might be a space that was always used for that. So having that support on those venues was really, really helpful.
What kind of support, though, was it explicitly?
I think it's the convening powers, it's, the meetings, the conversations with people, the coming to sessions.
So was that the Night Tsar themselves or a member of the team?
Because we border with Westminster and have got that kind of busy intersection. I know there have definitely been meetings convened with kind of venues and relevant people on kind of both sides of the road, because it cuts across.
Do you think that helps, having the Night Tsar perhaps visit sites, have those conversations? Is that happening enough?
I think it does help, because as I mentioned, sometimes it's just, particularly when there's campaigns and stuff, you need the attention. You need people to realise what is at risk, because again, it's very easy to say it's just a pub, it's just a theatre, but getting attention on it, because the Night Czar can convene a meeting of venues, councillors, operators, developers. That is really important, and that is a power that people can ignore me, but they definitely have more power to bring people in, have those conversations.
A recent question, I'm a councillor in Merton, was that the Night Czar hadn't visited Merton, and that I think that impacts that development that you just said about those conversations that were needed, and you've mentioned also the need for more power. Do you think that the Night Czar at the moment has the capacity to reach out to all these different parts of London right now, and is doing that currently?
I obviously can't speak to their diary or who invites them for meetings, but I'm sure they're kind of trying to get around as much as they can. But as I think you mentioned, what the boroughs need is very different. So I know lots of the work that has been done, particularly around women's safety, that cuts across all boroughs. So hopefully there'll be an opportunity for Merton to get a bit more of their time. And if you have got some venues at risk or any of those similar issues, I would absolutely, reach out, because we've had, and I know you've had, good experiences.
There's nighttime champions as well, isn't there, with each council? Do you think they're getting the right kind of support as well from the nighttime czar and the mayor?
In Camden, I don't think we have nighttime champions in the same way, but as I said, we definitely got support when we were working on our evening and nighttime entertainment strategy. When we did a full council meeting, a big public meeting, we had 8 speakers from residents to the industry. The Night Czar came and spoke then to talk about the work we'd done, how they'd supported it, and how it was kind of good to see Camden taking it seriously and listening to a range of voices. So
it seems that when the Night Czar's involved, it makes a difference.
Yeah,
but also not having them involved as well could also be a factor.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Assembly Member Small-Edwards.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on something Sabrina said. You were talking about resident engagement a bit, and I just wondered what came out of your evening and nighttime strategy on resident engagement. I think one of the reasons why councils can be quite restrictive in licensing, say, music venues is because they're very scared of what can be quite loud, organised residents who potentially aren't reflective of the entire community, being very vocal in opposing this just out of kind of fear of increased noise. So what suggestion would you have for other councils, other local authorities, in terms of their engagement on these licensing issues?
Yeah, I'd say that what I found really interesting about our Citizens' Assembly on this issue was, as I think I mentioned, how nuanced people really could be when you had a real conversation, when it wasn't the specifics of this venue next door to your house is going to be really lazy, really noisy, and like how much is going to upset you. It was more, what do you see your borough should be like? What do you think entertainment should be like? And once the conversation moved from always, post 11 p.m. noise and became more about like 6 p.m, like how do you want to engage in your community? People were far more open to those conversations. And also we found some of the sort of angriness and confusion came from venues they just had never been to, or things they didn't really ever get to engage with. So it just was this loud nightclub or this pub that gets a bit rowdy, when really it was like, oh, actually they do community stuff in the day, have you ever gone to that? So having those kind of conversations with residents, I think, is really important. But yeah, residents groups can be very, very organised when there is something they kind of want to campaign against or have an issue with, and you sometimes will get groups who just, as standard, will put in objections. But again, that is where well-trained licensing committees come in, and they have to be able to weigh everything up and have those conversations. And also, your licensing team should be speaking to them beforehand. And we make it very clear in Camden that our venues should listen to residents as well. So we do encourage them to have those conversations, so it doesn't always come to a head in a really aggressive licensing meeting, because we know that living in Camden is an absolute blessing, and it's really fun when you're engaging. But if you want to take a step back and maybe want a quieter life and you live in the middle of Camden Town, that might be a bit difficult. But all voices should be heard.
So do you have any thoughts on that, just from the music venue side, in terms of how they can best engage really with residents as early as possible and be reactive to any concerns.
Yeah, of course. I think the role, as Sabrina alluded to, the role of licensing and environmental health officers as well can be really useful in setting up that engagement between residents and music venues. So we found as well on rent issues as well, like mediation can be really helpful there. I think it's very much often there will be issues where a venue has changed nothing and is meeting their kind of best practice in noise, and then a complaint is thrown up. And I think, as I mentioned before, Hackney's early warning system has been really useful in that respect to kind of help venues out in understanding what the problem is, why the problem is, who and why might be complaining. But I think there's also something to be said around new residents and how informed they might be, which is absolutely not their fault. But if I give the example of the windmill in Brixton, when the developer put forward their plans, they used Google Maps, which has a little pop-up icon which notes the iconic music venue, the windmill. In no other of their plans was the windmill noted, despite it being opposite their development. And the windmill found out too late to put in their planning objection, and so we had to assist with them retrospectively. And so it's issues like that where new residents coming in to a development may not be aware at all that they are opposite an iconic music venue, and then the noise complaints start coming in, and that's when the music venue has real trouble doing anything about it, and then that leads to a closure. So I would say very much in terms of existing residents, we really like the engagement, the mediation, the early warning systems, and councils taking initiatives to do that. But in terms of new residents, more needs to be done around. So theatres are statutory consultees on planning. Grassroots music venues are not. That change seems bizarre from our sector, and I think if we could make a change like that, or really just see agent of change being properly enforced as it is set out in NPPF guidance, that could make a big difference both to venues but also to new residents as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Polanski.
Yeah, just briefly, I wanted to ask Sophie about solar panels on nightclubs, because clearly there's an obvious thing of in the day can carry on the energy and then in the evening reduce bills. Is there any campaigning around doing that to grassroots venues? And if not, is that something you would like to see your mayoral support with?
So I think music venues, energy prices are a huge issue, and not just London, it's across the UK as well. I think we're always looking for ways that venues can reduce their costs, as long as it is a sustainable way for them into the future. I think often venues can spend a lot of money on doing things, trying to up their attendance and get people in, that may backfire in the long run. But I think we'd always be keen to look at new ideas and ways that they can cut costs and also be more environmentally friendly as well.
That makes sense. Sabrina, I really like what you said earlier about people knowing that the space is a community space as well as doing stuff in the day. Is solar panels on grassroots venues and nightclubs anything that Camden's been looking into, just in terms of as well as bringing community energy into the area?
Yeah. I'm not sure if we have. My colleague looks after all of our sort of green transformation stuff, but it's definitely something I'll raise with Adam when I get back.
Perfect. Thanks. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. We're in an utterly bizarre situation at the moment, and I'm finding it hard to cope that we are way ahead of schedule, and I feel very uncomfortable about that, because I never feel like this. So we're never in this position. So I am going to ask the committee's indulgence, because we have you here as a panel, and the issue that I'm going to ask you about will be picked up in the second part of our investigation, but I'd like to ask you while we have you here. We've talked about grassroots venues, and this committee 2 years ago wrote a report about culture off the beaten track, which was an excellent piece of work that was spearheaded by Assembly Member Bakari, and there were certain issues that came out of that around minoritised and other marginalised communities. And I just wonder, whilst we have you here, if you could just spend a few minutes yourselves just talking about the issues that you think particular communities face and what you think some of the solutions. Obviously, we've talked about the generics issues, but specific issues with your expertise as well. And I wonder if I could start with Ben then, please.
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity. So I think one thing that comes up a lot with LGBT venues is around, there's the whole discussion around sort of inclusivity and whether the nighttime leisure sector is inclusive and the ways in which it is inclusive. And this comes up a lot in talking to both kind of commercial venue operators, but also grassroots groups. One of the ways it comes up is around kind of physical accessibility, because a lot of the venues, the more formal venues, have since the 80s been in kind of ex-infrastructure, ex-industrial spaces. So I think there's a kind of desire when we look at campaigns like the Friends of the Joiners Arms, who have been working for almost 10 years to reopen a space, that they're being very selective about what type of space they will use for reasons of accessibility. And they're really, when you look at the events that they produce, they're really thinking in really new ways about inclusivity that I think we can learn from. But there is this kind of problem of the physical infrastructure of the nighttime economy and how we can work, I like the utopian idea of adding solar panels to them, but is that there are other ways of kind of capturing that kind of energy and utopianism that gets built into nighttime economies and thinking creatively around these questions of inclusivity. I think the other way that this is coming up is around nighttime work. Well, there's two ways. One is around nighttime work. So one of the things that came out of the pandemic was one group of nighttime workers at Dalston Superstore, a really well-known venue in Dalston in Hackney, unionised. And actually, I think that was really interesting. They joined up with Unite, and they because the pandemic raised a lot of issues around the precarity of many of the freelancers and bar staff and other hospitality workers, but also all of those people that are kind of like informally working around those spaces. So thinking about kind of building on that sense of kind of collaboration to try and improve working conditions for people in hospitality. But also, I think the other big issue is around a kind of changing standards around welfare and well-being and safety in nighttime spaces. And I think that's a really big area where LGBT communities are certainly focusing a lot of attention at the moment. So safety teams, welfare teams that are appearing in nightclubs and, just offering, actually manifesting this role that we have talked about of nighttime venues having in supporting well-being, and realizing, because actually I think one of the important things for me is to think qualitatively. Not all nighttime venues produce the same kind of social value, so I think we really need to do that, to think about what is being offered really carefully. That's not to say that there's a simple equation between, really commercial venues and, better or worse provision of spaces of well-being. I don't think it's that simple, but I think we do need to think, especially when tools are being used that are bringing public investment into support venues. I think we need to think about what kind of public value is produced by those, or social value is produced by those different venues. And I think, certainly this area around safety and welfare is an interesting aspect of that at the moment.
Thank you. Sabrina.
I think this is probably a good point to mention, like some of the safety work. So, the Women's Safety Charter is really important. We gently suggest that all new licensees in Camden sign up to the Ask for Angela scheme and really take care of their patrons. And, that is building on the work that came from, the Mayor's office. So I think, it's kind of schemes like that. But something else, when I think about, minoritised groups, and obviously this is, not the main thrust of the stuff we came here to talk about, I do think about black music and urban events, using the largest speech marks there, and how they are perceived, policed and treated, because I think we have a history of it not always being fair. So I would like to believe that we've kind of moved on with some of that, because I do think we have, but just to kind of make sure that club promoters and venue owners and people who want to build community are all having as easy a time as each other across the piece.
Thank you. Sophie.
Yeah, I think there's sort of 3 points I would make about this, which all have been alluded to already. But I think the sort of safety at night element, for us, it's mostly around transport. I think a lot has been done to improve London's late night transport, but we always think more could be done to ensure that groups such as grassroots music venue workers, but also women and also students, coming in new to London. We want them to enjoy a kind of thriving music scene, but we also want them to feel safe getting home at night and know that kind of buses are safe, the tube is safe, and even walking home at night is safe. And I appreciate there are a lot of specifics that go into enabling that. I think the second point, which Ben mentioned, is accessibility. A lot of our venues, when they get grants or available funding, they're funneling that back into their venue, and it might be on things like sound systems, it might be on things like aircon, but it is also, for a lot of them, looking at ways they can make their venues more accessible. And I'm sure if many of you have been to a grassroots music venue, these are not always the most accessible venues. They are often below street level, they are often upstairs, and I think a lot of venues would appreciate more support and guidance and also funding on enabling those accessible features, because they can be really difficult for a venue to put in, but they are really keen to do it as well. And then just the third point I would make is London is so celebrated for being so multicultural and so diverse, and our grassroots music venues are a huge part of that. I mentioned earlier the cost they put on in enabling new music, experimental music, and the risk they take on that. And for a lot of people going to a grassroots music venue, that might be the one place that they see someone like them on stage, or they see someone putting the show on, or they see someone running the venue. At Music Venue Trust, we're big proponents of, if you can't see it, you can't be it. And we think music venues play a huge role in that, and we want to ensure that those venues remain open so that all communities can go and see people like themselves in those positions, and that they can aspire to be in that same position as well.
Thank you very much. So we've now reached the end of the session. A huge thank you to our panel, Sophie Brownlee, Councillor Sabrina Francis and Professor Ben Camping, for being our panel and giving us such great answers. I would like and could you just wait for a second, because we'd like to have a photo with you at the end. Just a tiny bit of business to finish. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from this discussion? Can I ask the committee to note the work programme and meeting dates and the additional activity undertaken since the last meeting, namely on our away day on the 12th of June 2024? The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 4th of September at 2 p.m. in the chamber at City Hall. Regarding any other business, I have no urgent business, which concludes today's meeting. And can I wish you all a very happy summer, and hopefully we'll get some sun. And those of you who are going away, have a lovely holiday, and I hope you'll think about me, because I am not going away. Thank you very much. Thank you.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.